Before we begin tonight's journey into one of history's most enduring mysteries, I want to take just a moment to ask for your support. If you're enjoying this content, using your hype points on this video helps the channel more than you could possibly know. For those listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes an incredible difference in helping others discover these stories. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing our community spread across the globe. If this is your first time here and you enjoy what you hear, consider subscribing. It means everything, and a huge thank you to Dogface680 for the continued support. Your engagement keeps this channel going. Now, let's dim the lights and step into a mystery that spans centuries. A name that should not reappear. There exists in the margins of recorded history a pattern that refuses explanation. Across 3 centuries, through revolutions and upheavals, amid the rise and fall of empires, the same name appears, the same face, the same voice, the same man, not a descendant, not a successor bearing a family title, the same individual. This is not legend passed through village storytelling. These are documented appearances in royal courts, witnessed by nobles, recorded by historians who had no reason to lie, and every reason to maintain credibility. The man's name was the Count of Saint-Germain. He possessed no confirmed place of birth. No verified death certificate exists. His origins remain deliberately obscured, his departure from history equally mysterious. Yet during his documented existence, he demonstrated knowledge that should have been impossible, spoke of events he could not have witnessed, and aged in ways that defied natural law. The central question is not whether Saint-Germain existed. That much is certain. Court records confirm it. Personal letters reference him. Paintings capture his likeness. The question that haunts researchers is far more unsettling. What if certain figures in history are not born in the conventional sense, but rather placed, positioned at critical moments across time, serving purposes we can only begin to comprehend? What if some individuals slip through the cracks of mortality itself? The Count of Saint-Germain represents either the most elaborate deception in European history, or evidence of something far stranger lurking beneath the surface of accepted reality. Tonight we examine the documented facts, the witness testimonies, the impossible coincidences, and the conspiracy theory that suggests this mysterious figure may have discovered something humanity was never meant to possess. The secret of life beyond death itself. Chapter 1. The first recorded appearances. The mid-1700s. Europe sits balanced between enlightenment and superstition, reason and ritual. Royal courts glitter with wealth and intrigue. It is into this world that the Count of Saint-Germain first emerges from historical shadow. He appears without preamble, without introduction from any known source. One moment the European aristocracy has never heard his name. The next, he's dining with kings. His first documented appearances place him in France, moving through the higher circles of society with an ease that suggests long-standing familiarity. He speaks French without accent, though clearly it is not his native tongue. The same proves true for German, English, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese and Russian. He demonstrates working knowledge of Arabic, Chinese and Sanskrit. When asked about his origins, Saint-Germain offers only vague pleasantries. He is from the East. He has travelled extensively. His family name carries weight in certain circles, though he declines to specify which circles or where. The French court, accustomed to posturing nobility, finds his reticence oddly compelling rather, and suspicious. There is no desperation in his manner, no grasping for status or wealth. He seems already to possess both, though no one can trace the source. Horace Walpole, the English writer and politician, encounters Saint-Germain in London during this period. In a letter dated sometime in the 1750s, Walpole describes him as a man who has been everywhere, knows everything, and reveals nothing. Walpole notes the Count's remarkable musical ability, his knowledge of chemistry that borders on the supernatural, and his curious habit of speaking about historical events as though he had personally witnessed them. the Count moves to Prussia next, entering the orbit of Frederick the Great. Here again, he arrives with no formal introduction, yet gains immediate access to the most protected circles of power. Frederick, known for his sharp intellect and intolerance for fools, welcomes Saint-Germain as both guest and confidant. Records from the Prussian court describe evenings where Saint-Germain would perform on the violin with such mastery that professional musicians refused to play after him. He would discuss military strategy with generals, philosophy with scholars, and art with painters. Each conversation revealed depth that suggested decades of study, yet no one could recall him ever being young. In Italy, the pattern repeats. Venice welcomes him. Florence opens its doors. He moves through Italian high society like a ghost passing through walls, present but somehow not quite solid, there but never quite permanent. What strikes observers across all these locations is consistency. Saint-Germain dresses impeccably but without ostentation. He wears diamonds of unusual size and quality, yet shows no interest in acquiring more. He attends dinners but rarely eats, claiming a special diet that sustains his health. He drinks wine but seems never to become intoxicated. His manners reflect perfect aristocratic training, yet carry none of the regional quirks that typically mark a nobleman's upbringing. It is as though he learned courtly behaviour from a universal handbook, rather than through childhood immersion in any particular culture. Most significantly, he demonstrates knowledge that should not exist in a single human lifetime. He speaks casually about the court of Francis I, who died 2 centuries earlier. He describes the personality of Anne Boleyn with the familiarity of personal acquaintance. When pressed, he laughs off such comments as the product of extensive reading and vivid imagination. But those who hear him speak sense something else. The details are too specific, the emotional texture too precise. He does not describe these figures as one recounts facts from books, but as one remembers actual people. The European elite, sophisticated and worldly, finds itself unable to categorise this strange visitor. He is clearly educated, clearly wealthy, clearly connected. But to what? To whom? No family claims him. No nation owns him. He appears to exist outside the normal structures that define identity in 18th century society. And as the years pass, a more disturbing observation begins to circulate in whispered conversations at royal gatherings. The Count of Saint-Germain does not age. Chapter 2. The Man Who Did Not Age. Time leaves marks. This is fundamental to human existence. Children become adults. Adults accumulate lines around their eyes. Hair greys, posture stoops. The body records the passage of years with merciless precision. Except, witnesses insist, in the case of the Count of Saint-Germain. The first whispers emerge perhaps a decade into his documented presence in European society. Nobles who met him in 1750 encounter him again in 1765 and privately remark on his unchanged appearance. Same smooth skin, same dark hair without trace of grey, same upright bearing and energetic movement. One might dismiss a single such observation. Memory proves unreliable. People often look younger than their years, but as more time passes, the observations multiply and become harder to rationalise. A marquise in the French court keeps a detailed diary throughout the 1760s and 70s. In one entry, she recounts a conversation where she mentioned having met Saint-Germain at a gathering hosted by her mother decades earlier, when the marquise herself was a child. She had been perhaps 8 years old at the time. Saint-Germain had looked, she estimated, to be in his mid-40s then. 40 years later, standing before her at another royal function, he appeared exactly the same. Still in apparent middle age, still possessing the vitality of a man in the prime of life. When she raised this observation, Saint-Germain smiled and suggested that perhaps she remembered incorrectly, or perhaps he had a relative who resembled him. The marquise noted in her diary that his explanation satisfied no one who'd been listening to the exchange. Similar accounts emerge from other sources. A Venetian merchant records meeting Saint-Germain in 1755, and again in 1770. The merchant specifically notes the Count's unchanging face, writing that while he himself had grown old and weathered by trade and travel, his companion from 15 years prior showed no such deterioration. Even more striking are the accounts of Saint-Germain's own casual references to the distant past. He does not make these statements as grand claims or attempts to impress. Rather, they slip out in conversation, almost by accident. A musician recalls Saint-Germain critiquing a performance by comparing it to a concert given by a famous composer who had died over a century before. When asked how he could possibly know about such a performance, Saint-Germain paused, seemed momentarily unsettled, then recovered and attributed the knowledge to family stories passed down through generations, but the specificity suggested something else. He described the acoustics of the hall, the clothing of the audience, the particular mistakes the performer made in the third movement. These were not details preserved in family legend. A scholar of languages engaged Saint-Germain in discussion about the evolution of French pronunciation. Saint-Germain, again seemingly without thinking, corrected the scholar's assumptions by providing examples of how certain words were actually spoken in the court of Louis XIV. When the scholar pointed out that no reliable phonetic records existed from that period, Saint-Germain simply smiled and changed the subject. The conspiracy theory begins to take shape not through grand revelations but through accumulated small impossibilities. No single incident proves anything. Each observation can be explained away individually. Misremembering, exaggeration, confusion, family resemblance, extensive research combined with vivid imagination. But together, these accounts sketch a picture that resists conventional explanation. They describe a man who exists outside the normal flow of time, who has somehow found a way to step sideways through history, while the rest of humanity marches forward toward inevitable decay. By the 1770s, Saint-Germain's apparent agelessness has become the subject of polite speculation among the aristocracy. No one accuses him directly. European manners forbid such directness, but the whispers persist. Some suggest he has discovered an alchemical secret. Others propose he possesses a rare medical condition that preserves youth. A few, usually after significant amounts of wine, wonder aloud if he might be something other than human entirely. Saint-Germain himself seems unbothered by the speculation. He continues attending functions, engaging in conversation, pursuing his mysterious projects. If he knows that half of Europe is quietly questioning his nature, he shows no concern. Perhaps because he has already survived similar scrutiny for far longer than anyone suspects. Perhaps because he knows that suspicion without proof is merely gossip, and gossip without evidence eventually fades. Or perhaps because he understands something about human nature that his observers do not. That people will ultimately choose a comfortable lie over an uncomfortable truth, and the truth of his existence is far too uncomfortable for 18th century minds to accept. The question persists across decades. Was the Count of Saint-Germain simply a skilled deceiver trading on resemblance and research? Or was something much stranger walking among the crowned heads of Europe, hiding in plain sight behind a veil of charm and careful evasion? The evidence, such as it is, leans disturbingly toward the latter. Chapter 3: Alchemy and Forbidden Knowledge. In an age caught between the last flames of mysticism and the rising light of rational science, alchemy occupied a peculiar position. Publicly mocked by Enlightenment thinkers as medieval superstition, it was simultaneously pursued with deadly seriousness behind closed doors by some of the wealthiest and most powerful individuals in Europe. The Count of Saint-Germain positioned himself at this exact intersection of dismissed magic and hidden practice. His knowledge of chemistry was undeniable and documented. He could discuss metallurgy with master craftsmen and reveal techniques they had never encountered. He understood the properties of minerals and gems with precision that suggested either extensive study or hands-on experience spanning decades. Most famously, he claimed the ability to remove flaws from diamonds. This was not merely impressive in terms of value. The technical process would require understanding crystalline structure at a level not formally achieved by science for another century. Yet multiple witnesses reported seeing Saint-Germain take flawed stones and return them, days or weeks later, visibly improved. Countess von Georgi, a wealthy collector of precious gems, recorded her own experience with Saint-Germain's abilities. She possessed a diamond of significant size, but marred by visible inclusions that reduced its worth substantially. Saint-Germain examined it briefly, then asked if she would trust him with it for 3 weeks. She agreed, though she admitted later to some nervousness about releasing such a valuable item to someone whose permanent residence remained unknown. He returned the stone exactly 21 days later. The inclusions had vanished. The diamond's clarity had improved from what modern gemologists would classify as heavily included to nearly flawless. The Countess had the stone examined by 3 separate jewellers, all of whom confirmed the change but could not explain it. When asked about his method, Saint-Germain would only say that certain processes, applied with patience and precision, could encourage crystalline structures to reorganize themselves. He made it sound simple, even natural. None of the jewellers who examined the result could replicate it. This was far from his only demonstration of unusual knowledge. He prepared dyes and pigments that painters insisted produced colours more vibrant and longer lasting than any they had previously used. He created cosmetics that noblewomen swore had genuine restorative properties for aging skin. He mixed medicines that, according to those who consumed them, produced effects beyond what herbal remedies typically achieved. None of this proved supernatural ability. A brilliant chemist with access to resources and time could potentially achieve similar results. But the breadth of Saint-Germain's knowledge suggested something beyond individual genius. It suggested accumulated experience. The conspiracy theory proposes that what Saint-Germain demonstrated were not party tricks or fortunate experiments, but rather the refined techniques of someone who had spent not decades but centuries perfecting these processes. Someone who had witnessed the evolution of chemistry from its ancient origins through medieval alchemy and into early modern science. Someone who understood that what later ages would dismiss as magic was simply chemistry, practiced before the formal vocabulary existed to describe it. Consider the implications. If Saint-Germain had genuinely discovered a method to extend human life far beyond natural limits, what else might he have discovered? What other secrets might centuries of continuous existence have allowed him to uncover? The alchemical texts of earlier ages spoke of transmutation, not just lead into gold, though that captured popular imagination, but fundamental transformation of base elements into refined ones. Most significantly, they spoke of the philosopher's stone, a substance that supposedly granted its possessor both unlimited wealth and unlimited life. Saint-Germain never claimed to possess such an object, but he never quite denied it either. When, asked directly about alchemical secrets, he would typically deflect with humour. He might say that if he possessed unlimited wealth, surely he would dress more extravagantly. If he had discovered immortality, would he waste it attending dinner parties? But those listening carefully noticed he never said these things were impossible, only that if he possessed them, he would presumably behave differently than he did. It was the answer of someone threading a very careful needle, denying nothing, confirming nothing, allowing speculation to swirl while providing no solid evidence in any direction. The European elite found this both frustrating and fascinating. Here was a man clearly in possession of remarkable knowledge, yet utterly unwilling to share it or even fully acknowledge it. He would demonstrate capabilities that seemed impossible, then brush away questions as though he had merely performed a clever parlour trick. The effect was to leave witnesses uncertain of what they had actually seen. Had the diamond truly improved? Or had Saint-Germain somehow switched it for a better stone? Had the dyes really performed beyond normal chemistry? Or had the painters simply never encountered that particular combination of ingredients before? The uncertainty served Saint-Germain well. It kept him interesting without making him threatening. European society could accept a mysterious genius with unusual skills. It could not accept an immortal alchemist who had violated the fundamental laws of nature. So the theory remained whispered rather than spoken. The evidence remained suggestive rather than conclusive, and Saint-Germain remained free to move through society, neither fully exposed nor fully hidden, occupying that narrow space between the explainable and the impossible. But the question lingered then and lingers still. What had this man actually discovered? And if he had found a way to cheat death, why would he choose to spend his endless years dining with nobles and performing chemical demonstrations? Unless, of course, he had other purposes, hidden agendas that required proximity to power and access to information, objectives that would only become clear when viewed across the span of centuries rather than years. Chapter 4. Warnings Ignored. History records that the Count of Saint-Germain involved himself in politics with considerable care and surprising frequency. For a man who claimed no national allegiance and maintained deliberate mystery about his background, he showed persistent interest in the affairs of European states. More specifically, he appeared to position himself as an early warning system. Multiple accounts place Saint-Germain in conversation with King Louis XV of France during the 1760s and early 70s. The content of these conversations was meant to remain private, but details leaked through courtiers and servants, as details always do in royal households. Saint-Germain, according to these fragmentary accounts, warned the king of coming upheaval. He spoke of unrest in the countryside, of philosophical movements that would harden into political revolution, of a moment approaching when the French monarchy would face an existential crisis. Louis reportedly listened but dismissed the warnings as exaggeration. France had weathered internal conflicts before. The aristocracy remained powerful. The church provided spiritual authority. The military ensured order. Saint-Germain allegedly responded that surface stability often masks deep rot, that institutions which seem permanent can collapse with startling speed once certain thresholds are crossed, that the signs of coming revolution were already visible to those who knew how to read them. The king, according to witnesses, found these pronouncements interesting but not convincing. Saint-Germain had no official position. He represented no intelligence network. His warnings carried no institutional weight. What made them unsettling was not their source, but their specificity. Saint-Germain did not speak in vague prophecies or mystical symbolism. He identified concrete problems: debt accumulation, rural poverty, intellectual movements questioning traditional authority, the gap between aristocratic lifestyle and common suffering. These were observable facts, but Saint-Germain wove them into a narrative of inevitable collapse that most observers found overly pessimistic. He spoke as though he had already witnessed this pattern before, as though he recognized the symptoms of societal breakdown from personal experience. When asked how he could be so certain of future events, Saint-Germain reportedly responded that history moves in patterns, that those who study these patterns across sufficient time can begin to recognize when certain outcomes become not just possible, but probable. It was the answer of a historian, or of someone who had lived through similar cycles before. The warnings went unheeded. Louis XV died in 1774. His grandson Louis XVI inherited an increasingly unstable situation. 15 years later, the Bastille fell. 5 years after that, the king and queen faced execution. Everything Saint-Germain had warned about came to pass. This sequence of events could be coincidence. An intelligent observer in the 1770s could have recognized warning signs and extrapolated likely outcomes. Political instability tends to follow predictable patterns. Someone well-read in history might have simply made educated guesses. But the conspiracy theory suggests a different interpretation. Saint-Germain spoke with certainty because he had witnessed similar revolutions before, because he had stood in other courts, in other centuries, and watched the same pattern unfold. Because when you have lived long enough, you begin to see the repetitions. The French example was not isolated. Records place Saint-Germain in Russia before the death of Empress Elizabeth. He allegedly advised against certain policies that would create resentment among the nobility. His advice was not taken. Political instability followed. He appeared in Austria during a period of diplomatic tension. Contemporary accounts suggest he advocated for particular treaty arrangements that might preserve peace. Those arrangements were not pursued. Conflict erupted. Again and again, across different nations and different contexts, the pattern repeats. Saint-Germain positions himself near centres of power. He offers counsel. The counsel is ignored. Events unfold in ways that validate his concerns. One could argue this proves nothing except good political instincts and unfortunate timing, except for one additional detail that witnesses consistently report. Saint-Germain spoke about these coming events not with the anxiety of someone predicting disaster, but with the weary resignation of someone who had already witnessed the same disasters multiple times before. He did not sound like a prophet warning of doom. He sounded like a teacher watching students ignore lessons they would eventually learn the hard way. There was a quality of sadness in his warnings, according to those who heard them. Not the sadness of someone imagining future suffering, but of someone remembering past suffering and recognizing its return. A nobleman from the Prussian court wrote in his memoirs about a private conversation with Saint-Germain in which the Count spoke about the inevitable cycle of enlightenment and barbarism, how societies build, peak and collapse, how knowledge gets lost and rediscovered, how each generation believes itself wiser than those before, only to make the same fundamental mistakes. The nobleman found the conversation fascinating but also deeply melancholic. Saint-Germain spoke like someone exhausted by repetition, like someone who had watched the same drama play out across so many stages that he could recite all the lines before the actors spoke them. If the conspiracy theory holds truth, this makes terrible sense. Imagine possessing the ability to see the patterns, to know what comes next, but lacking the power or position to actually prevent it. Imagine being condemned to watch humanity make the same errors across centuries, unable to intervene effectively because intervention requires the kind of authority that only comes with official position. Saint-Germain never held office, never commanded armies, never wrote laws. He existed in the margins, advising but never directing, warning but never controlling. Perhaps this was by choice. Perhaps someone who had lived through centuries understood that power corrupts across any time span, and the only safety was in influence without authority. Or perhaps he had tried more direct intervention in earlier eras and learned through bitter experience that changing human nature exceeds the capability of even an immortal observer. Either way, the historical record shows a consistent pattern. Saint-Germain, watching, warning, and ultimately witnessing his warnings come true while the world insisted on learning its lessons the expensive way. And when revolution finally consumed France, when the warnings proved prophetic, when blood ran in streets and aristocrats faced execution, the Count of Saint-Germain had already moved on. Because if you cannot stop the catastrophe, there is no point in dying in it. Not when you still have so much more history to witness. Chapter 5. The Death That Solved Nothing. In late February of 1784, official records indicate that the Count of Saint-Germain died at the residence of Prince Charles of Hesse-Kassel in Eckernförde, Germany. The death certificate exists. It lists the deceased's name, the date, the location. By all bureaucratic measures, the mystery of Saint-Germain should end here. It does not. The problems begin with the circumstances themselves. Saint Germain had been residing with Prince Charles for some time, engaged in alchemical experiments and philosophical discussions. The prince was one of Saint-Germain's closer associates, perhaps as close to a friend as the mysterious count permitted anyone to become. When Saint-Germain allegedly fell ill, the prince attended to him personally. When death came, the prince arranged for burial. All very proper and documented. Yet Prince Charles himself later made statements that cast doubt on whether the event had actually occurred as recorded. In letters written years after the supposed death, the prince referred to Saint-Germain in present tense. He spoke of the count's work continuing. He alluded to communications received and meetings held. When questioned about these references by confused correspondents, the prince would become vague or suggest that perhaps he misspoke. But the pattern of present tense references continued for years. More disturbing are the reported sightings. Within months of the official death, witnesses claimed to have seen Saint-Germain in Vienna. The reports were specific enough to include descriptions of his clothing, his manner of speaking, his unchanged appearance. One account came from a baroness who insisted she had dined with him. She described the conversation in detail, including Saint-Germain's comments on current political events. When told that the count had died earlier that year, she became angry. insisting that she was not mistaken and not prone to hallucinations. Similar reports emerged from Paris, Venice, and London over the following years. Each witness described the same man, same refined manner, same apparent age, same reluctance to discuss his background. Skeptics dismissed these as cases of mistaken identity. Someone must have resembled Saint-Germain closely enough to be confused for him. Perhaps the Count had relatives who shared his features. But the sightings continued into the next century and the next. By the mid-1800s, reports placed Saint-Germain in locations across Europe and beyond. A traveller claimed to have met him in India. A merchant swore he had negotiated a business deal with someone matching every detail of Saint-Germain's description in Constantinople. Each sighting could be explained individually. Human memory is fallible. People see what they expect to see. Con artists could have adopted Saint-Germain's identity for various purposes, but the sheer number of reports, spread across such vast geography and lengthy time, begins to strain those conventional explanations. The conspiracy theory offers two possible interpretations. First, that the death certificate from 1784 was falsified. Perhaps Saint-Germain needed to disappear from European society for reasons of his own. Perhaps the attention was becoming burdensome. Perhaps enemies were closing in. Whatever the motivation, he arranged with Prince Charles to stage a death, provide documentation, and allow him to move on under new circumstances. The second interpretation is far stranger but potentially more accurate, that Saint-Germain actually did die in 1784 and the death was simply irrelevant. If Saint-Germain had genuinely discovered some method of transcending mortality, perhaps what occurred in Eckernförde was merely a temporary disruption. Perhaps what witnesses saw as death was simply a transition point in a process the rest of humanity does not understand. This second interpretation requires accepting premises that violate everything modern science teaches about death and consciousness. It demands belief in concepts that sound more like fantasy than history. Yet the witness testimony persists. The reports continue. The sightings accumulate across decades and centuries. A particularly intriguing account comes from the late 1800s. A journalist investigating spiritualist movements interviewed a woman who claimed regular contact with advanced spiritual entities. During the interview, she described one entity who visited in physical form rather than through channeling. Her description matched Saint-Germain precisely, down to details about his speech patterns, his courtesy, his habit of deflecting personal questions. She knew nothing of the historical Count, had no prior knowledge of his documented existence in the 1700s. When the journalist later researched historical records and showed the woman paintings from the 18th century, she confirmed that was the individual who had visited her. The journalist published the account but positioned it as evidence of delusion or fraud. He could not accept the alternative, that he had stumbled across evidence of someone moving through history unchanged, treating centuries like others treat years. By the early 1900s, Saint-Germain had transformed in public consciousness from historical figure to mythological symbol, but the sightings did not stop. A soldier in World War I wrote letters home describing an officer who appeared during critical battles, offered tactical advice that saved lives, then vanished before anyone could properly thank him. The descriptions aligned with Saint-Germain. The soldier had no knowledge of who Saint-Germain was. A woman in Paris during the 1930s kept a diary in which she recorded meeting an elegant gentleman at a cafe who spoke perfect French, but with an archaic formality. He discussed the coming war with specific predictions about how it would unfold. When she saw him again months later and mentioned their previous conversation, he smiled and suggested she must be confusing him with someone else, but his predictions proved accurate. Each account, taken alone, proves nothing. Memory distorts. People lie. Coincidence explains much. But the pattern stretches across too much time, touches too many independent witnesses, maintains too much consistency to dismiss entirely. The death that was supposed to end the mystery of Saint-Germain instead became just another chapter in it. The official record states he died. The unofficial testimony suggests he simply moved on. And if the conspiracy theory holds truth, perhaps that distinction matters less than we assume. Perhaps for someone who had already transcended normal human limitations, death itself was just another door to walk through, not an endpoint but a passage. The Count of Saint-Germain, according to documents, died in 1784. The Count of Saint-Germain, according to witnesses, kept walking. One of these statements must be false. Or perhaps our understanding of what death means is simply too limited to encompass what Saint-Germain had become. Chapter 6. The Theory of the Observer. The accumulated evidence, such as it is, forces a question. What exactly was the Count of Saint-Germain? The conventional answer, an unusually talented charlatan who exploited aristocratic credulity for personal gain. Someone who studied history extensively and performed chemistry tricks to create an aura of mystery. Perhaps a series of related individuals using the same name and cultivating resemblance to maintain the deception across generations. This answer satisfies those committed to materialist explanations. It requires no violation of natural law. It preserves our understanding of mortality as absolute and universal, but it struggles to account for the specificity of witness testimony, the consistency across unconnected sources, and the sheer duration of the phenomenon. The conspiracy theory must therefore propose something more radical, that Saint-Germain represents either an immortal being, someone with access to time travel, or what some researchers have called a custodian of historical continuity. Consider each possibility. Immortality requires believing that Saint-Germain discovered an alchemical or biological process that halted or reversed aging. Not impossible in theory. Modern science has identified genetic and cellular mechanisms related to aging. Some organisms demonstrate negligible senescence. If Saint-Germain had somehow stumbled upon or deliberately created a method to trigger similar effects in humans, he could have achieved functional immortality. This would explain his unchanged appearance. It would explain his accumulated knowledge. It would explain why death certificates failed to end his presence in history. But it struggles to explain some of the stranger elements, the perfect timing of his appearances, his uncanny political predictions. The sense witnesses report that he spoke about history not as past events, but as personal memories. Time travelled offers a different framework. If Saint-Germain possessed the ability to move backward and forward through historical periods, appearing when and where he chose, it would explain many of the anomalies. He could appear in multiple centuries because he was visiting from outside the normal flow of time. He could speak with certainty about future events because for him they had already occurred. He could vanish and reappear because he was simply travelling to different temporal locations. This theory has appeal but creates its own problems. It requires accepting technology or capability that seems impossible even by modern standards. It suggests that someone or something provided Saint-Germain with abilities far beyond anything humanity has achieved. The third option, the custodian theory, takes a different approach. Perhaps Saint-Germain is not a single individual at all, but rather a role. A position that different entities occupy across time, serving a function we do not fully understand. The role of observer. This theory suggests that there exist in reality certain individuals tasked with watching history unfold, maintaining records, offering guidance when appropriate but never directly controlling events. They appear during periods of instability or transition because those are the moments when their observation becomes most critical. They do not intervene with force because intervention is not their purpose. They witness, they advise, they warn, but ultimately they allow human history to develop according to its own internal logic. Saint-Germain, in this framework, would be either one observer who has maintained the role across centuries, or a title passed between different observers who share certain characteristics and training. This would explain the consistency of description combined with the impossible longevity. It would explain why Saint-Germain appeared during revolutionary periods across different nations. It would explain his access to power combined with his lack of official position. Observers would need to remain outside normal social structures to maintain their objectivity. They would need to understand human nature across cultures and eras. They would need to resist the temptation to use their knowledge for personal gain. Saint-Germain demonstrated all these qualities. He refused wealth when it was offered. He declined official positions when they would have granted him power. He maintained distance from personal relationships that might have compromised his independence. The conspiracy theory proposes that these were not random character traits, but rather the disciplines of someone fulfilling a specific role. Someone who understood that observation requires detachment, that knowledge must not become control, that witnessing history means accepting its tragedies without preventing them. But if this theory holds truth, it raises the most disturbing question of all. Who assigned this role? Who decided that human history needed observation? And what did the observers do with the information they collect? Are they reporting to some higher authority? Preserving records for purposes we cannot fathom? Or are they simply bearing witness because consciousness itself demands that someone remember, someone understand, someone maintain continuity across the chaos? The Count of Saint-Germain, by this interpretation, was never meant to be understood. He was meant to watch while the rest of humanity lived and died and forgot. He appeared when needed not because he controlled events, but because the observer's role demands presence during transformative moments. He offered warnings not because he could prevent disaster, but because the observer must at least try, even knowing the attempt will fail. And he vanished not because his work was complete, but because each era eventually moves beyond the crisis point, returning to periods of stability, where observation requires less visibility. This theory cannot be proven. It exists in the realm of speculation built on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony that could always be explained away. But it offers a framework that accounts for the patterns without requiring us to accept any single impossible thing. We do not need to believe in immortality or time travel or supernatural intervention. We need only accept that some aspect of reality includes roles and purposes beyond conventional understanding. That consciousness might organize itself in ways we have not yet recognized. That the universe might include structures and functions that operate on timescales and through mechanisms outside normal perception. The Count of Saint-Germain, custodian of continuity, witness to transformation, observer of humanity's endless cycle of growth and collapse, never intervening, always watching, forever present at the margins of history, waiting for the moments when his quiet guidance might make a difference, knowing it rarely will, continuing anyway because the role demands it. If true, it suggests we have never been alone in our historical journey, that someone or something has always been watching, recording, remembering. Whether that should comfort us or terrify us remains an open question. Chapter 7. Secret Societies and Silence. The Count of Saint-Germain moved through European high society with remarkable ease, but beneath that glittering surface, rumours connected him to something darker and deeper. Secret intellectual circles, proto-Masonic networks, and the underground preservation of forbidden knowledge. The 18th century witnessed an explosion of secret societies. Masonic lodges spread across Europe and beyond. The Illuminati formed and dissolved. Rosicrucian orders claimed ancient lineage and mysterious wisdom. These organizations positioned themselves as inheritors of knowledge, too dangerous or too sacred for public consumption. Saint-Germain appears in the margins of many such organizations, never quite at the centre, but never quite absent either. Masonic records from the period occasionally reference a mysterious figure matching his description, attending lodge meetings in various cities. The references are frustratingly vague, often identifying him only as the stranger or the traveller, but the contextual details suggest the Count's involvement. What makes these connections significant is not simply his presence, but what witnesses reported he contributed. He did not come seeking initiation or advancement through ranks. He arrived already possessing knowledge that impressed even the highest-ranked members. An account from a French Masonic lodge describes an evening when Saint-Germain attended as a guest. The master of the lodge presented a philosophical puzzle drawn from ancient Egyptian symbolism, expecting it to generate discussion and debate. Saint-Germain listened briefly, then offered a complete interpretation, explaining the layered meanings, the historical context, and connections to other symbolic systems. The master later wrote that the visitor demonstrated understanding that would typically require decades of study and initiation into mysteries the lodge had spent years carefully preserving. When asked how he came to possess such knowledge, Saint-Germain smiled and suggested that some truths are rediscovered independently by those who look deeply enough. This pattern of mysterious expertise repeats across different societies and different countries. He appears, he demonstrates knowledge, he offers insights, then he moves on, leaving members both impressed and unsettled. The Rosicrucian connections are even more intriguing. The Rosicrucian manifestos, published in the early 1600s, spoke of a secret brotherhood possessing alchemical and scientific knowledge far beyond common understanding. They claimed ancient origins and promised eventual revelation of transformative wisdom. Several historians have noted that Saint-Germain's documented abilities and knowledge align remarkably well with what the Rosicrucian manifestos promised. His chemistry skills, his understanding of languages and history, his apparent longevity, his refusal to claim membership in any organisation while simultaneously demonstrating insider knowledge. One conspiracy theory suggests that Saint-Germain was not merely connected to the Rosicrucians, but was perhaps one of their original founders, using the public manifestos to create plausible cover for knowledge he had accumulated through other means. This would explain why he never formally joined any lodge or society, despite obviously possessing the knowledge such groups protected. He already had access to the source. The organisations were attempting to preserve and distribute information he had helped originate. But all of this raises a critical question. What knowledge were these societies actually protecting? The conventional answer is that they preserved philosophical and symbolic systems that helped members achieve spiritual enlightenment or moral improvement. They studied ancient wisdom traditions and attempted to apply those insights to contemporary life. The conspiracy theory suggests something more concrete, that secret societies were repositories for actual practical knowledge that mainstream society had rejected or forgotten. That embedded within their symbols and rituals were instructions for processes that worked but could not be explained through accepted frameworks. Saint-Germain's involvement would make sense in this context. If he had discovered genuine methods for life extension, metallurgical transformation, or other capabilities deemed impossible, he could not simply publish this information. Mainstream science would reject it. Religious authorities might condemn it. Political powers would seek to control it. Better to encode it within symbolic systems. Better to preserve it through initiation and careful teaching. Better to maintain it within organisations sworn to secrecy. The societies would serve as insurance. If Saint-Germain disappeared or died or chose to withdraw from public life, the knowledge would persist. Others could access it. Through patient study and proper initiation. This interpretation casts secret societies in a different light. Not as mere philosophical clubs or social networks, but as actual archives of functional knowledge, maintaining information across generations through deliberate obscurity. Saint-Germain's connections would represent his insurance policy, his way of ensuring that whatever he had discovered would not die with him. Of course, no direct proof exists for any of this. Secret societies by definition keep their actual work secret. What appears in public records and historical documents represents only the surface layer, the acceptable face shown to external observers, what happened in private meetings, what knowledge actually passed between initiates, what methods actually worked versus what existed purely as symbol or aspiration. These questions remain locked behind oaths of secrecy that extended beyond death. But the patterns suggest protection. Saint-Germain appeared to have access to power structures that should have been closed to someone with no official status. He moved through Europe pursued by no serious investigation, despite his obvious wealth of mysterious origin. He demonstrated capabilities that should have attracted dangerous attention but somehow remained free to continue his work. This level of protection typically requires institutional backing, the kind of backing that comes from being embedded within networks powerful enough to shield their members from conventional authority. Secret societies of the period operated across national boundaries. They included members from aristocracy, military, clergy, and commerce. They could provide identity papers, safe houses, communication networks, and political influence. For someone like Saint-Germain, these societies would have been essential. They allowed him to maintain his mystery while still accessing the resources needed to continue whatever purposes drove his centuries-long presence, and, in return, what he offered them was infinitely more valuable. Confirmation that their systems, their symbols, their carefully guarded secrets actually pointed towards something real. That alchemy was not just metaphor, but method. That spiritual transformation was not merely psychological, but potentially physical. That the promises embedded in their rituals were not empty hopes, but coded instructions. If even a fraction of this theory holds truth, it reframes the entire history of secret societies. They become not curious historical footnotes, but essential infrastructure for preserving knowledge that official history had rejected. And the Count of Saint-Germain becomes their proof of concept, walking evidence that the impossible could be achieved, living testimony that their most carefully guarded secrets were worth protecting. The societies maintained silence about Saint-Germain not to protect themselves, but to protect him. Because if the world understood what he represented, the questions that would follow would threaten everything they had built. Better to keep the mysteries mysterious. Better to let the Count remain an enigma, moving through history in shadow, witnessed but never exposed, present but never proven. The silence was not conspiracy in the sinister sense. It was preservation, safeguarding both the knowledge and the person who embodied it, and perhaps, somewhere in the archives of organisations that still exist today, records remain, documents that name the unnamed visitor, journals that describe the demonstrations, instructions passed down through careful initiation, or perhaps the Count took his secrets with him when he finally chose to withdraw entirely from human observation, leaving only symbols, stories, and the echo of what once was possible. Chapter 8: The Ascended Master Transformation. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Count of Saint-Germain underwent a curious transformation in public consciousness. He shifted from historical figure to spiritual symbol, from mysterious nobleman to what various mystical movements termed an ascended master. This change began with Theosophy, the spiritual movement founded by Helena Blavatsky in the late 1800s. Theosophical teaching spoke of highly evolved spiritual beings who had transcended ordinary human limitations and now guided humanity's spiritual development from higher planes of existence. Saint-Germain was identified as one of these ascended masters. According to theosophical doctrine, he had achieved spiritual enlightenment that freed him from the cycle of death and rebirth. He now existed in a perfected spiritual body, appearing in physical form when necessary to guide humanity, but primarily operating from dimensions beyond normal perception. This interpretation had appeal. It explained his apparent immortality without requiring acceptance of physical alchemy. It accounted for his vast knowledge by positioning it as spiritual rather than merely intellectual advancement. It transformed the mystery of his disappearances into evidence of his transcendent nature. Later movements built on this foundation. The I Am activity, founded in the 1930s, placed Saint-Germain at the centre of its teachings. Founder Guy Ballard claimed direct contact with the Ascended Master, receiving teachings and instructions that formed the basis of the movement's philosophy. According to Ballard, Saint-Germain communicated messages about spiritual evolution, cosmic hierarchy, and humanity's destiny. The Count became a teacher figure, offering guidance to those who sought spiritual advancement. Other New Age movements adopted similar frameworks. Saint-Germain appeared in channeled messages, automatic writing, and spiritual visions. He became associated with concepts like the violet flame of purification, spiritual transformation, and preparation for humanity's next evolutionary stage. This transformation from historical person to spiritual archetype solved certain problems while creating others. On one hand, it allowed Saint-Germain's story to continue beyond the limitations of historical evidence. As a spiritual being, his continued presence did not require physical sightings or documentary proof. Believers could maintain connection through meditation, prayer, and spiritual practice rather than demanding concrete evidence. On the other hand, It threatened to bury the historical reality beneath layers of spiritual interpretation. The actual Count of Saint-Germain, whoever and whatever he truly was, became overshadowed by the symbolic Saint-Germain of mystical imagination. The conspiracy theory offers an intriguing interpretation of this transformation. Perhaps the mythologization was deliberate camouflage. Consider the strategic value of being transformed from mysterious historical figure into spiritual symbol. Once Saint-Germain became associated primarily with New Age movements and channeled messages, serious historical researchers would dismiss him entirely. The association with what mainstream academia considers fringe spirituality would actually protect the truth. Anyone investigating the real Count would encounter walls of mystical interpretation that obscured the documentary evidence. The genuine sightings would be mixed with invented spiritual encounters. The actual demonstrations of chemistry would be drowned out by claims of cosmic consciousness and violet flame visualization. This would serve Saint-Germain perfectly if he wished to continue operating while avoiding serious investigation. By allowing or even encouraging his transformation into spiritual mythology, he could effectively disappear from credible history while remaining present in ways that attracted only believers rather than skeptical researchers. It is a nearly perfect cover. Who would search seriously for an immortal alchemist when everyone knows he is really an ascended master existing on higher spiritual planes? The absurdity of the spiritual claims would make the historical claims seem equally absurd by association. But what if both were true? What if Saint-Germain had genuinely achieved something that could be described either as alchemical immortality or spiritual ascension, depending on one's framework? What if the mystical language was simply a different vocabulary for describing a real transformation? Ancient spiritual traditions speak of physical immortality achieved through internal alchemy. Taoist practices describe methods for transforming the physical body into a vehicle capable of transcending death. Indian yoga systems include teachings about attaining immortal physical form through specific disciplines. What mainstream spirituality dismisses as metaphor might be literal instruction. What seems like fantasy might be experiential report from those who succeeded. Saint-Germain could have discovered or rediscovered these methods. What he demonstrated through chemistry might have been the external manifestation of internal processes. His alchemical work with metals and gems might have been parallel to alchemical work on his own body and consciousness. In this interpretation, the Theosophists and later movements were not inventing mythology. They were describing reality using the only language available to them. They encountered evidence of someone who had transcended normal human limitations and interpreted it through their spiritual framework. The description was accurate even if the explanation was incomplete. This possibility suggests that the historical Saint-Germain and the ascended Master Saint-Germain might be the same entity, viewed through different lenses. The nobleman attending court functions was the physical manifestation. The spiritual guide teaching through visions and messages was the same consciousness operating from a different level. But it also raises disturbing questions about agency and manipulation. If Saint-Germain deliberately encouraged his own mythologization, what else might he have influenced? How many spiritual movements might have been nudged in particular directions? How much of what we consider spontaneous spiritual evolution might have been carefully guided by someone with centuries of experience in shaping human thought? The transformation from historical figure to spiritual symbol could represent the Count's greatest achievement, ensuring his continued relevance across centuries while making himself impossible to investigate seriously. Future generations would preserve his name and basic story while completely missing the reality. They would invoke him in spiritual practice, while never seriously asking whether he still walked among them in physical form. The perfect disguise is not invisibility. It is being seen but misidentified, being present but categorized as absent, existing while being classified as mythological. The Count of Saint-Germain, if he still exists, could move through the modern world completely unnoticed because everyone knows he is a spiritual concept rather than a physical person. And perhaps that was always the goal, to remain present without being found, to continue the work of observation and guidance while finally achieving the anonymity that centuries of visibility had denied him. The Ascended Master transformation was not the end of the Saint-Germain story. It was perhaps the beginning of its most sophisticated chapter, the moment when the Count finally learned how to hide in plain sight by making himself too spiritual to take seriously. History could no longer track him because history had handed him over to mythology, and mythology never demands proof. Chapter 9. Modern Sightings and Cultural Echoes. The 20th century did not end the Saint-Germain phenomenon. If anything, the pattern accelerated, though the character of the reports changed. The sightings became less formal, less connected to aristocratic circles, more distributed across social classes and geographic locations. Saint-Germain, if these accounts are believed, democratized his presence. A particularly intriguing cluster of reports emerged from California during the spiritual awakening of the 1960s and 70s. Multiple individuals, often with no connection to each other, described encounters with a courtly, refined man who seemed oddly out of time. He would appear at spiritual gatherings, listen quietly to discussions, then offer observations that demonstrated comprehensive understanding of esoteric traditions from multiple cultures. When asked about his background, he would deflect gracefully and disappear before anyone could gather detailed information. One woman kept meticulous records of her encounter at a meditation center in Marin County. She described a visitor who attended an evening lecture on alchemy and consciousness. After the formal presentation, the visitor approached the speaker and, with perfect courtesy, corrected several historical points. The speaker, irritated at being challenged, demanded to know the visitor's credentials. The man smiled and said he had simply read extensively on the subject. Then he proceeded to discuss alchemical texts in their original languages, demonstrating knowledge that went far beyond casual reading. The woman recorded that the visitor's manner of speaking reminded her of period films set in the 1800s, not in accent exactly, but in cadence and formality. He used grammatical constructions that felt archaic but not forced, as though English was a language he had learned long ago and never quite updated. When she attempted to find him after the evening concluded, he had vanished. None of the other attendees knew his name or how he had learned about the gathering. The meditation centre had no record of anyone matching his description. Similar accounts appeared throughout the period. A mysterious gentleman at a Berkeley bookstore who could discuss Hermetic philosophy in Greek. An unnamed guest at a Topanga Canyon gathering who demonstrated knowledge of medieval mysticism that surprised even the experts present. A visitor to Esalen who spoke about consciousness expansion as though from personal experience spanning centuries. Each sighting could be dismissed individually. California in the 60s and 70s attracted many eccentric scholars and spiritual seekers, but the consistency of descriptions, the pattern of deep knowledge combined with mysterious identity, suggested something beyond coincidence. The reports extended beyond California. The jeweller in Amsterdam told colleagues about a customer who brought in an unusual diamond and requested specific modifications to its setting. The customer's manner reminded the jeweller of descriptions he had read about Count Saint-Germain. When he made a joking reference to this, the customer's expression became unreadable. He collected the modified piece days later, paid in cash, and never returned. A music historian in Vienna encountered someone at an antique instrument exhibition who could discuss the exact acoustic properties of specific violins from the 1700s. Not from study, but the historian later insisted from apparent personal experience playing those exact instruments. In each case, the individuals vanished before establishing ongoing contact or leaving traceable information. The pattern suggests someone still moving through the world, still engaging with topics of long-standing interest, but now operating with far greater care about remaining unidentified. Perhaps centuries of visibility had taught necessary caution, or perhaps the modern world's surveillance capabilities required additional discretion. Cameras, databases, digital records, these technologies make sustained anonymity increasingly difficult. Someone trying to maintain mystery in the 21st century would need to be far more careful than was necessary in the 18th. The conspiracy theory proposes that Saint-Germain adapted his methods to match changing circumstances, where once he could attend court functions confident that documentation would be minimal and tracking nearly impossible, now he must operate in shadows, limiting his presence to context unlikely to generate permanent records. But he has not withdrawn entirely. The sightings continue, though they become harder to verify, easier to dismiss. A blog post from 2008 described an encounter at a rare books auction in London. The author noticed another attendee who bid successfully on several 18th century alchemical manuscripts. During a break, they struck up conversation. The buyer discussed the manuscripts with intimate familiarity, not as collector, but as someone reconnecting with old friends. When the author asked if the buyer planned to donate the manuscripts to a library or university, the buyer smiled and said they belonged in private hands. "Some knowledge," he reportedly said, "is better preserved than distributed." The author tried to continue the conversation later, but could not locate the buyer anywhere in the auction house. These modern accounts lack the weight of historical documentation. They survive only as personal testimony, blog posts, forum discussions. They convince no one not already inclined to believe, which might be exactly the point. If Saint-Germain still walks among us, he has learned that the best way to maintain presence is to ensure that any evidence of that presence appears too questionable to take seriously. The occasional sighting becomes merely another internet anecdote. The mysterious encounter just a stranger with unusual knowledge. The unexplained disappearance simply someone who valued privacy. Modern skepticism provides better cover than 18th century aristocratic discretion ever did. But perhaps the most interesting shift is cultural rather than evidential. Saint-Germain has become a reference point, a shorthand for a particular kind of mystery. Books, films and television shows invoke his name when they need a symbol of hidden knowledge and impossible longevity. This cultural presence serves a function beyond entertainment. It normalizes the idea of someone moving through history unchanged. It makes the concept familiar enough that actual encounters might be dismissed as people confusing reality with fiction they have consumed. The perfect disguise for someone who still exists would be to ensure everyone knows the story but considers it mythology. To be so famous that no one believes you are real. And if the conspiracy theory holds truth, perhaps that was always the trajectory. Perhaps Saint-Germain's journey was always moving toward a moment when he could finally stop hiding, because no one would think to look for him. The modern world, with its comfortable materialism and certainty about the limits of the possible, has handed someone like Saint-Germain the greatest gift imaginable, collective disbelief. He can walk through our world invisible not because we cannot see him, but because we have decided in advance that he cannot be real. And so he persists, witnessed but unconfirmed, present but unproven, continuing whatever purposes have sustained him across centuries, while we look past him toward more acceptable explanations. The sightings continue, the stories accumulate, the pattern persists, and somewhere in the margins between verified fact and dismissible fiction, a courtly figure from another era continues his eternal observation of humanity's ongoing drama. Also, the theory suggests, truth, as always, remains just beyond reach. Chapter 10. Why History Cannot Close the File. Most historical mysteries eventually resolve. New documents surface. Scholars develop consensus. The pieces fit together into coherent narrative. Questions that once seemed impossible to answer yield to patient research. The Count of Saint-Germain resists this pattern. Centuries of investigation have produced no birth certificate, no baptismal record, no family tree linking him to any established lineage. He appears in European society fully formed, adult and educated, with no documented childhood or adolescence. This absence is not simply gap in record keeping. Researchers have examined archives across Europe. They have investigated noble families that might have produced him. They have traced every hint and rumour about his possible origins. Nothing conclusive emerges. Every lead evaporates. Every connection proves insufficient. Similarly, no verified death permanently closes his story. The 1784 death certificate exists, but as we have seen, it solves nothing. Sightings continue, witnesses multiply. The pattern persists beyond what official documentation claims ended. Modern researchers find themselves in a paradox. The evidence for Saint Germain's existence is overwhelming. Dozens of contemporary sources confirm his presence. Paintings depict him, letters mention him. Court records place him in specific locations at specific times. But the evidence for who he actually was, where he came from, and what happened to him remains impossibly thin. This should not be possible. 18th century Europe was not some pre-literate society, where people appeared and disappeared without trace. Records were kept. Noble families documented their lineages obsessively. Movements across borders required papers and permissions. Yet Saint-Germain navigated all of this while leaving almost no official trail. Just enough to confirm his presence, never enough to reveal his nature. The descriptions from witnesses maintain remarkable consistency. Different people in different countries over different decades describe the same individual. Same appearance, same mannerisms, same patterns of knowledge and behaviour. This consistency defies the usual degradation of information across time and distance. Normally, when a story passes through multiple witnesses, details shift, exaggerations creep in, contradictions appear, the signal degrades. With Saint-Germain, the signal remains surprisingly clear. Whether someone met him in 1755 or 1775, whether the encounter occurred in Paris or Vienna, the description stays consistent. He was of medium height, elegant but not ostentatious in dress, dark hair without grey, courteous manner, multilingual, knowledgeable about chemistry, music, history and philosophy, reluctant to discuss his background, apparently unchanged by passing years. These are not vague generalities. They are specific, repeated observations from credible witnesses who had no reason to coordinate their accounts. The coincidences accumulate. Saint-Germain appears during periods of political instability across multiple nations. His warnings consistently prove accurate. His chemical demonstrations succeed in ways witnesses cannot explain. His access to power persists despite lacking official position. Any single coincidence might be dismissed, but the pattern as a whole begins to strain conventional explanation. Skeptics argue that we are seeing ordinary events reinterpreted through the lens of mystery, that Saint-Germain was simply a skilled con artist who exploited noble credulity, that the consistency of descriptions merely reflects nobles copying each other's accounts, that the whole phenomenon can be explained through psychology and social dynamics. These explanations have merit. They require no violation of natural law. They preserve our understanding of reality as bound by familiar limits, but they struggle with the details. Con artists typically leave victims. Saint-Germain apparently defrauded no one. His interactions with nobility were social rather than financial. He neither asked for money nor accepted positions that would have provided it. What was his angle? What did he gain from the deception? The usual answer is status and comfort, but he possessed both and seemed uninterested in expanding either. If anything, he appeared to minimize his presence rather than maximize it. Similarly, the coordinated deception theory fails to explain reports from witnesses who knew nothing of each other. A merchant in Venice had no contact with a composer in Paris, yet their descriptions of Saint-Germain align perfectly. The file remains open because no theory fully accounts for all the evidence. Accepting Saint-Germain as merely human requires ignoring too many strange details. Accepting him as something more requires abandoning too many foundational assumptions about reality. We are left in the uncomfortable middle, unable to prove the extraordinary claims, unable to fully dismiss them. This is not the territory of solved mystery. This is the realm of permanent ambiguity, of questions that resist answering regardless of how much evidence accumulates. The Count of Saint-Germain exists in historical record. This much is certain. What he actually was remains speculation. Was he immortal? A time traveller? A series of related individuals maintaining a deception? An ascended master? A custodian of hidden knowledge? A brilliant charlatan? All of these theories have adherents and arguments. None has proof sufficient to end debate. The mystery persists because it is structured to persist. Every question opens another. every answer generates new uncertainties. The closer we examine the evidence, the more it seems to shift and reconfigure. Perhaps this is coincidence. Perhaps we are simply missing key documents that would resolve everything. Somewhere in an archive or private collection, perhaps the answers sit waiting to be discovered. Or perhaps the mystery was designed never to be solved. Perhaps Saint-Germain understood exactly how to position himself at the edge of proof, present enough to be remembered, absent enough to resist confirmation. Perhaps the entire phenomenon was carefully constructed to maintain exactly this level of uncertainty. Enough evidence to intrigue, never enough to conclude. If so, it represents mastery not just of alchemy or time, but of information itself, the ability to control what can be known about oneself across centuries. And if the conspiracy theory holds any truth, perhaps that control continues. Perhaps someone, somewhere, still curates the Saint-Germain mystery, adding occasional sightings, ensuring certain documents remain hidden while others surface, maintaining the pattern while preventing resolution. The file cannot close because someone does not want it closed. The mystery persists because mystery serves a purpose we do not fully understand. History demands answers. The Count of Saint-Germain offers only more questions, and somewhere in that gap between what we can prove and what we cannot dismiss, the truth resides. Unknowable, unprovable, undeniable. Epilogue. The role that remains. We have journeyed through centuries of mystery, examined witness testimony and historical documents, considered theories ranging from the mundane to the impossible. We stand now where every investigator of the Saint-Germain phenomenon eventually stands, uncertain. If we accept the most extraordinary interpretation, if we believe the conspiracy theory that suggests the Count of Saint-Germain was something beyond normal human, we must ask a final question. Why? What purpose would drive someone to maintain such presence across centuries? What goal would justify the careful concealment, the calculated mystery, the deliberate positioning at the margins of history? The theory suggests observation, that Saint-Germain served as witness to human development, that his role was not to control or direct, but simply to watch and record. This aligns with the evidence. He advised but never commanded, warned but never intervened with force, preserved knowledge but never weaponized it, engaged with power but never seized it for himself. These are the disciplines of someone committed to observation rather than participation. Someone who understands that true understanding comes from watching without interference, that the moment you begin to control the system, you can no longer accurately measure it. If Saint-Germain genuinely possessed abilities beyond human norm, immortality or time travel or spiritual transcendence, the temptation to use those abilities must have been overwhelming, to prevent disasters, to guide humanity toward better outcomes, to shape history according to superior knowledge. That he apparently resisted this temptation suggests either remarkable discipline or specific constraints. Either he chose not to intervene, or he could not. Perhaps the role of observer comes with rules. Perhaps whoever or whatever granted Saint-Germain his abilities also imposed limitations. Watch, but do not control. Advise, but do not compel. Preserve, but do not reveal. This would explain the patterns we have seen, the warnings that were ignored, the knowledge that was demonstrated but never fully shared, the presence that continued across centuries while achieving little visible impact. Frustrating for someone who could see the patterns, who knew what was coming, who understood how to prevent suffering, but necessary if the goal was something beyond preventing specific disasters. If the purpose was understanding humanity as it actually is rather than as it might ideally be. We study animals in their natural habitats without intervening because intervention would invalidate the observations. We maintain scientific controls precisely to avoid contaminating results with our presence. Perhaps Saint-Germain approached human history with similar discipline. Perhaps he understood that to truly understand our species, he needed to witness us making our own choices, learning our own lessons, following our own trajectory, even when that trajectory led to revolution, war and suffering, even when he could have prevented it. This interpretation transforms the Count from mysterious nobleman into something far more significant, the consciousness bearing witness to our collective journey, the eternal student of human nature, the patient recorder of our endless repetitions. And if this theory holds truth, perhaps he watches still. Not from spiritual dimensions or mystical planes, but from ordinary life, standing in crowds, sitting in cafes, observing the same patterns repeating in new forms, watching us make the same mistakes with different technologies, witnessing the eternal human struggle between what we know we should do and what we actually choose. Perhaps he no longer needs to hide because we have stopped looking. Perhaps he has finally achieved the perfect camouflage of our collective disbelief. Or perhaps he has simply moved on. Perhaps after witnessing enough centuries of human behaviour, the patterns became clear enough that continued observation became redundant. Perhaps the project, whatever it was, reached completion. We cannot know. The evidence never becomes sufficient to close the questions. But if there is someone still watching, still recording, still bearing witness to our species as we stumble through history making the same errors in new contexts, the knowledge might provide strange comfort. It suggests we are not alone, that our story matters enough to be witnessed, that consciousness somewhere recognizes value in observing our journey even when we cannot see it ourselves. The Count of Saint-Germain, real or myth, historical figure or spiritual archetype, represents something humanity needs. The sense that our actions matter enough to be remembered. That someone is watching who understands the long patterns. That the eternal now of human experience connects to something beyond immediate circumstance. Perhaps he was real. Perhaps he still exists. Perhaps he waits somewhere in the margins of our modern world for the next moment of crisis that requires his subtle presence. Or perhaps he was always symbol rather than substance. A story we tell ourselves about the possibility of transcendence, about knowledge that persists when civilizations fall, about consciousness that endures when bodies fail. Either way, the mystery remains, the questions persist, and somewhere between the documented and the impossible, the Count of Saint-Germain continues to exist, neither proven nor disproven, neither dead nor fully alive in history, neither forgotten nor truly remembered, eternal in the only way that matters, as a question that refuses to be answered. The file remains open, not because we lack information, but because the information we possess refuses to resolve into certainty. And perhaps that was always the point. Perhaps the Count's greatest achievement was not immortality or time travel or chemical mastery, but the construction of a mystery sophisticated enough to survive centuries of investigation while maintaining perfect ambiguity. If so, he succeeded beyond imagination. The Count of Saint-Germain, whatever he was, achieved what few in history ever have. He became impossible to forget and equally impossible to confirm. He entered our collective consciousness and never left. He walks through our cultural imagination unchanged across centuries. He persists in the one realm where immortality is actually achievable. Story. And there, in the space between fact and fiction, history and myth, proof and possibility, the Count of Saint-Germain remains, watching, waiting, wondering if we will ever understand what he represented, or perhaps no longer caring whether we do. The mystery endures, the questions remain, and somewhere in the darkness between what we know and what we believe, a courtly figure from another era continues his eternal observation, or so the theory suggests. You decide. Before we begin, If you're enjoying this story and want to support the channel in a way that helps more than you could possibly know, please consider using your hype points on this video. It makes a massive difference in helping us reach more people who love these kinds of mysteries, and if you feel like it, drop a comment telling us what time it is, where you are, and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from across the globe. No pressure, but we really do enjoy connecting with all of you out there in the dark, wherever you are. Now, let's begin. The call came through at 3:47 in the morning, not to my phone, to my computer, through a chat program I hadn't opened in 6 years. The message was simple: you found it. Now you need to forget it. No profile picture, no username, just a string of random characters that looked like corrupted data. I stared at the screen in my dark apartment, the only light coming from my monitor and the distant glow of streetlights through half-closed blinds. My coffee had gone cold hours ago. I'd been awake for 31 hours straight, deep in a rabbit hole I'd promised myself I'd never go down again. The John Titor case. And now someone knew I'd found something. Something that proved the most famous time traveller in internet history might have actually been real. Prologue. The night that started everything, December 14, 2000. Late night. Coast to coast AM. I was 19 years old, living in a studio apartment in Tucson, working night shifts at a 24-hour copy centre. Insomnia had been my companion since childhood, and Art Bell's radio show had become my nightly ritual. The strange, the unexplained, the absolutely bizarre. Art covered it all with that signature gravelly voice that made even the most outlandish claims sound plausible. That night started like any other. I had the radio playing low while I reorganised my comic book collection, a mountain of back issues threatening to avalanche off my desk. Art was taking calls, the usual mix of UFO sightings and government conspiracy theories, when he mentioned something that made me stop mid-action. "We've been getting some interesting emails," Art said, that curious tone entering his voice, the one he used when something genuinely intrigued him. "From someone claiming to be posting on internet forums, says he's a time traveller from the year 2036. I set down the comic I was holding, an old X-Files tie-in issue, and turned up the volume. Art continued. "He's been posting since November, apparently. Calls himself John Titor. Says he's here on a military mission." There was a pause, the sound of papers rustling. Let me read you what he wrote. Quote, "I am here on a military mission. My time machine is a stationary mass temporal displacement unit." End quote. The words hung in the air of my tiny apartment. I'd heard hundreds of times traveller claims on Coast to Coast over the years. They usually fell apart within minutes. Vague predictions, convenient excuses, obvious attention seekers. But something about this one felt different. The terminology, the specificity, the claim of a military mission rather than some grand save-the-world scenario. I grabbed a notebook and started writing down everything Art said. That night I became a John Titor follower. Just a fan, like thousands of others. I had no idea that 23 years later I'd uncover something that would make me wish I'd never heard that broadcast. Act 1. The original investigation, Chapter 1. Coast to Coast, an archive. Dive. Fast forward to November 2023. I'm 42 years old now. Still an insomniac. Still listening to Coast, though George Nuri hosts it now. Art Bell retired years ago and passed away in 2018, taking with him one of the most unique voices in radio history. I work as a data analyst for an insurance company, a job that pays well enough but leaves my mind understimulated. I spend my nights the way I spent them in 2000, diving into mysteries, reading forums, chasing threads that lead nowhere. But I hadn't touched the John Titor case in over a decade. It had been solved, more or less. Debunked, depending on who you asked. The general consensus was that Titor was an elaborate hoax, possibly connected to a Florida lawyer named Larry Haber, though nothing was ever proven. The predictions didn't come true. No American Civil War in 2005, no worldwide Olympics after 2004, no radical restructuring of society by 2015. Case closed. Move on. Except, I couldn't stop thinking about something I'd noticed years ago. Something that nagged at the back of my mind like a splinter I couldn't quite reach. The audio. I'd saved copies of the coast-to-coast broadcasts where Art Bell discussed Taita. 3 main episodes. January 12, 2001, the most famous appearance. January 15, 2001, the follow-up. And an open line night where multiple callers claimed Taita had contacted them privately. On a Wednesday night in early November, unable to sleep despite trying for 4 hours, I decided to listen to them again. Not for nostalgia, for something I remembered hearing but never investigated. I put on my headphones, opened the audio files, and started with the January 12 broadcast. Art's voice filled my ears, warm and welcoming, introducing the topic of time travel. Then playing clips of someone claiming to be John Titor responding to questions, reading his posts aloud. I listened to the entire episode normally the first time through. Then I listened again with audio editing software open, frequency analysis running, sound isolated into different channels. That's when I heard it clearly for the first time, behind Art's voice, underneath the normal phone line static and compression artifacts of early 2000s radio broadcasting. There was a hum, a steady rhythmic hum that pulsed at irregular intervals. I isolated it, amplified it, ran it through spectral analysis. The hum wasn't random. It had structure, peaks and valleys at specific frequencies, and underneath that something else, a clicking pattern that repeated every 7 seconds. It sounded eerily similar to old modem handshake protocols, but deeper, more complex. I logged it in a document. Anomalous audio signature in Taita broadcasts. Possible line interference or encoding artifact. Further investigation needed. At the time, I assumed it was just technical interference. Phone lines in 2000 weren't exactly high fidelity. Radio broadcasts went through multiple stages of compression and transmission. It could have been anything, but I kept listening. Chapter 2. John Titor's Real Claims. Over the next week, I went deeper than I'd ever gone before. I compiled every single post John Titor made to the forums where he originally appeared. Time Travel Institute and the old Art Bell post-to-post forums, both archived now but still accessible if you knew where to look. Titor's first post appeared on November 2nd, 2000, under the name timetravel_0. He described himself as an American soldier from the year 2036, sent back in time on a military mission to retrieve an IBM 5100 computer from 1975. The computer, he claimed, was needed to debug legacy Unix systems that would become critical in his timeline's future. His story was detailed, disturbingly detailed. He described his time machine, a C204 temporal displacement unit manufactured by General Electric. He posted technical diagrams showing a gravity distortion system using dual microsingularities held in magnetic suspension. He explained how the device worked, using terms like Kerr black holes and quantum field manipulation. He talked about his timeline's history, how a civil conflict would begin in America in 2005 following civil unrest and federal overreach, how it would escalate into a full civil war by 2008, how Russia would launch a nuclear strike in 2015, killing millions but ultimately leading to a simplified community-based society by 2036. He described life in his time, no internet as we knew it, decentralized communities, manual labour and agriculture being primary occupations, technology that was advanced in some ways but deliberately limited in others to prevent centralised control. He answered hundreds of questions, some scientific, some personal, some trying to trip him up. And when predictions didn't match our reality, when 2005 came and went without civil war, when the Olympics continued past 2004, when the nuclear strike didn't happen in 2015, Titor's defenders had a ready answer, because Titor himself had provided it. Many timelines exist, he'd written. Mine may not be yours. My presence here may have already altered events. or you may simply exist on a different world line than the one I departed from. It was the perfect escape clause, unfalsifiable, impossible to disprove because any discrepancy could be explained by timeline divergence. Genius if you were running a hoax, terrifying if you weren't. I read through everything again with fresh eyes, and I noticed patterns I'd missed before. Tita never made predictions that could be immediately verified. He spoke about things years in the future, always leaving enough gap time that verification was impossible in the moment. He answered technical questions with impressive detail, but always with enough vagueness that experts couldn't definitively say he was wrong. And he never, ever provided proof that couldn't be explained away, except for one thing, the physics. Several theoretical physicists had analysed Tita's explanations of time travel mechanics. While much of it was speculative, some of his descriptions of rotating black hole physics and closed time-like curves were remarkably sophisticated for a random internet poster in 2000. Not impossible for someone well read in theoretical physics to fake, but impressive nonetheless. One researcher noted that Tita's description of temporal acceleration matched some classified DARPA research that wasn't publicly known until 2004. How did a hoaxer know that in 2000? I added it to my notes, filed it under Interesting but Inconclusive. Chapter 3. The Haber Connection. Every investigation into John Tita eventually led to the same place. Larry Haber, an entertainment lawyer in Florida. The connection was discovered around 2009 by a group of dedicated researchers who traced internet records, domain registrations, and communication patterns. They found that the Tita family's communications, after John stopped posting in March 2001, were allegedly handled by Haber's legal office. Haber and his brother, Maury, were somehow connected to the Tita Foundation, an organisation that claimed to represent the Tita family. The foundation sold a book compiling Tita's posts, and even shopped around a movie deal at one point. The Haber brothers never confirmed or denied involvement in creating the Tita story. They maintained that they simply represented the interests of the time traveller's family, specifically his mother, who supposedly wanted to protect her son's identity. It was all very convenient and very suspicious. Over the years, researchers had tried to definitively prove the Haber connection. Some claimed success, others hit dead ends. The general consensus in the skeptical community was that one or both Haber brothers, possibly with accomplices, had created the entire Tita persona as either an elaborate art project or a potential media property. Case closed, right? I decided to reach out anyway. I found Larry Haber's law office contact information, still operating, still listed in Florida, and sent a carefully worded email. I identified myself as a researcher looking into the cultural impact of the John Tita story, asked if he'd be willing to discuss his involvement in representing the Tita family, and assured him I was approaching this from an academic perspective rather than as a debunker. 3 weeks passed, no response. I followed up, still nothing. On the 4th week, I got a reply, but not from Haber. The email came from an address I didn't recognise. The subject line read, "Regarding your Tita inquiry." The message itself was brief. Some cases are closed for a reason. Let this one stay buried. No signature, no explanation. I tried to reply. The email bounced back. Address didn't exist. I should have stopped there. Act 2. The clue no one ever followed. Chapter 4. The lost interview tape. I've always had a weakness for old electronics. Ham radios, vintage computers, obsolete media formats. There's something appealing about technology from eras when things were built to last, when you could take apart a device and actually understand how it worked. That's why I found myself at a ham radio swap meet in Phoenix on a Saturday morning in late November. It was held in a community centre parking lot. Card tables loaded with vintage equipment, cables, antique radios, and boxes of components salvaged from who knows where. I was browsing a table of old broadcast equipment when a man next to me said, "You look like someone who appreciates the old stuff." I glanced over. He was probably in his late 60s, weathered face, wearing a trucker cap with a faded CB Radio Club logo. His table was mostly vintage CB equipment and cassette tapes of radio broadcasts. "Guilty," I said. "There's something about equipment from before everything became computerized." "Everything had character back then," he agreed. "Even the static sounded better." He chuckled at his own joke. "Name's Bill Anders." "Ethan Ward." We shook hands. His grip was firm, the handshake of someone who'd spent a lifetime working with his hands. "You collect broadcast tapes?" he asked, gesturing to his collection. "Sometimes. Depends what's on them." Bill studied me for a moment, then said something that made my stomach tighten. "You ever listen to Coast AM?" "All the time," I said carefully. "Been listening since the 90s. Art Bell fan?" "He was the best." Bill nodded slowly. Then he leaned in slightly and lowered his voice. "Then you might be interested in something I've got. Something that never aired." I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "What do you mean?" "Art Bell recorded an unaired call," Bill said. "From John Teeter. You know who that is?" My heart started racing. I kept my expression neutral. "The time traveller guy. Sure." "The studio. Then cut out before it could air," Bill continued. "Happened sometimes with Art's setup, especially with weird calls that came through on specific frequencies. Producers usually destroyed recordings of dropped calls, but this one..." He trailed off, looking around the swap meet casually. "This one somebody leaked. I got a copy on cassette." "From who?" I asked. "Someone who worked at the station, friend of a friend. Died about 5 years back. I've been holding on to it. Never knew what to do with it. Figured most people wouldn't care. But you..." He looked at me with sharp eyes. "You look like someone who'd care." "Why are you telling me this?" Bill shrugged. "Getting old. Want to pass things on to people who'll appreciate them. And honestly, the tapes always creep me out a little. Rather have it in someone else's hands." He reached under his table and pulled out a plastic case with a cassette inside. The label was handwritten in faded ink. C2CAM, Tighter Call, Never Broadcast. "How much?" I asked. $20. I handed him the money so fast I nearly fumbled my wallet. Chapter 5. Audio Analysis. I didn't even wait until I got home. I stopped at a Goodwill on the way back and bought a cassette player for $8, drove to a parking lot and sat in my car with my laptop and a cassette to USB adapter I kept in my emergency kit for exactly these kinds of moments. The tape hissed to life. Art Bell's voice came through first, that familiar cadence. "We have a caller on line 4 who says he has information about the temporal displacement claims. Go ahead, caller." Static. Then a voice. Distorted, like it was being filtered through something. Not dramatically altered, but wrong somehow. Like listening to someone talk through a bad connection. But the wrongness wasn't in the quality, it was in the sound itself. "Art, this is John Teeter," the voice said. "I need to clarify something about the device specifications." "Go ahead, John, we're listening." The voice continued, explaining something technical about the C204 unit's power requirements. But I barely heard the words. I was focused on the background. That hum. The same one I'd heard in the aired broadcasts, but clearer, much clearer. And there was more. An electronic sound layered beneath it. Not random static. Something structured. The call lasted maybe 90 seconds before the line went dead. Art's voice returned. "Lost the caller. Let's go to line 6. I sat in my car and listened to the tape 4 more times. Then I drove home, transferred it to digital, and opened it in professional audio editing software. I spent the next 12 hours analysing that 90-second clip. First, I isolated the background sounds from the voice. Then I ran spectral analysis on the hum. Then I focused on the electronic noises underneath. What I found made me physically uncomfortable. The hum wasn't phone line interference. It was too clean, too structured. It pulsed at exact 7-second intervals with frequency variations that followed a mathematical pattern. When I graphed it, the pattern looked like a sine wave passing through a quantum probability field. Something I'd seen in papers about experimental physics, but never in audio recordings. The electronic sounds were even stranger. They resembled encrypted packet bursts, but deeper and more complex than anything used in commercial communications in 2000. When I ran them through frequency analysis, they contained patterns that matched military-grade encryption from the 1980s. specifically the kind used in classified communication systems that were only partially declassified in the late 90s. These sounds shouldn't exist on a phone line in 2000. They definitely shouldn't exist on a call to a radio show. I needed a professional opinion, but I couldn't risk asking anyone in my professional network. Too many questions, too much potential exposure. I found a freelance audio analyst on a forensics forum, someone who advertised their services for legal cases and took anonymous clients. I created a burner email address, sent him the file with no context, and asked for a technical analysis of the background anomalies. I paid via cryptocurrency. 3 days later, he responded, "This is unusual. The hum pattern matches nothing in standard telecommunications. The encryption bursts are definitely military grade, similar to protocols used in classified systems from the Cold War era." But here's what's really strange. This wasn't made on any consumer equipment available in 2000. The encoding quality suggests professional grade hardware, possibly military issue. Where did you get this? And why are you asking about it? I didn't respond. The analyst sent 2 more emails over the next week, increasingly insistent. I need to know where this came from. If this is evidence in a criminal case, I'm obligated to report it. Please respond. I deleted the email account. Ached 3. The Modern Thread. Chapter 6. A new title message. November 2nd, 2023. Exactly 23 years after John Titor's first post. I was at work, mindlessly processing insurance claims, when my phone buzzed with a notification I'd set up years ago. An alert that triggered whenever someone mentioned John Titor on certain forums and boards I monitored. Most alerts were false positives, people discussing the old case, sharing theories, nothing new. But this one was different. The alert came from an obscure time travel discussion board that had maybe 20 active users, the kind of place conspiracy theorists went to die quiet deaths of obsession. I opened the page on my phone. A new account had been created that morning. Username timetravel_2036. It had made exactly 1 post, time-stamped at 3:14 a.m. Ethan Ward, stop digging. This is not your timeline to fix. My hands went numb. I read it again. Then again. My name. My actual name. On a forum I'd never posted on under my real identity. I'd always used aliases when discussing Titor online, careful to never connect my real identity to my research. How did someone know I was investigating? I checked the user profile, created 3 hours ago. No other information. No email listed. No avatar. I clicked on the username to see if there were any other posts. The profile page loaded. Account deleted. The post was still there, but the user no longer existed. I screenshot everything, my heart hammering. Then I did something I should have known better than to do. I tried to trace the IP address. The forum had open source server logs available to moderators, and with the right tools, anyone who knew where to look. I found the entry for that post. The IP address was registered to White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. I stared at my screen, certain I'd made a mistake. I ran the trace again. Same result. White Sands. A major military installation. One that happened to be involved in advanced physics research and experimental technologies. I decided to dig deeper. I used a more sophisticated tracking tool, one that showed the path the connection took before posting. That's when things got truly bizarre. The connection originated from White Sands. Then it jumped to CERN in Geneva, Switzerland. Then it vanished completely. No exit node, no further trace, nothing. It simply terminated in the middle of transmission in a way that shouldn't be technically possible. I sat at my desk, surrounded by mundane insurance paperwork, and felt reality tilt slightly off its axis. Someone at White Sands, or someone using their network infrastructure, had posted a message to a forgotten forum telling me specifically to stop investigating John Titor, and they'd routed it through CERN, one of the world's premier particle physics laboratories, the place where they smash atoms and study the fundamental nature of reality, the place where some conspiracy theorists believe time travel research might actually be conducted. Chapter 7. Contact from a coast-to-coast insider. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my apartment with every light on, periodically checking the forum to see if the message was still there or if I'd imagined the whole thing. It was still there. Username deleted, IP trace impossible to run again because the logs had been wiped. At 2:37 a.m, my phone rang. Unknown number, local area code. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Ethan Ward? A woman's voice, older, tired sounding. Who is this? My name is Amy Jacobs. I used to produce for Coast to Coast AM back when Art was still hosting. I heard you've been asking questions about John Titor. My mouth went dry. How did you hear that? Because I've been monitoring Titor-related searches for 15 years, she said, and you just triggered about 8 different alerts I set up. You found something, didn't you? I don't know what you mean. The audio. You found the anomaly in the audio. Silence stretched between us. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. How do you know about that? I finally asked. Because Art found it too, Amy said. Years ago, before he retired. He never talked about it publicly, but he knew something was wrong with those broadcasts. He asked me to analyse them. I found the same thing you did. The hum, the encryption patterns, everything. And then we started getting inquiries from people who shouldn't have been interested. Defence contractors, government agencies, someone from a place in Virginia that wouldn't identify themselves directly but was clearly intelligence community. They requested all Titor-related correspondence, all the tapes, all the caller information we had. Did you give it to them? We didn't have a choice. They had paperwork, official requests. Art was furious, but there was nothing he could do. I started pacing my apartment. Why are you calling me? Because you found something we didn't. You got further than we did, and I think you're in danger of stumbling onto something that powerful people want to stay hidden. What did Art think it was? Amy was quiet for a long moment. Art believed a Titor wasn't posting from 2000. He believed Titor was broadcasting into 2000, from somewhere else, someone else. That's impossible. Is it? Explain the encryption patterns. Explain the quantum acoustic signature. Explain how someone in 2000 had information about classified research that wasn't public yet. She paused. Ethan. Art spent the last years of his life quietly investigating this. He never went public because he couldn't prove anything, and because he was scared of what it meant. What did it mean? It meant someone had figured out how to communicate backwards through time, and they were testing it on the most public platform possible, hiding the truth in plain sight, wrapped in conspiracy theory and internet culture, so that anyone who actually believed it would be dismissed as a lunatic. I sat down heavily on my couch. Why would they do that? I don't know, but Art had a theory. He thought Titor's mission wasn't to convince the public of anything. It was to calibrate something, to send controlled messages into the past and measure the effects, to ensure certain future events occurred or were avoided, and Coast to Coast AM, with its global reach and eclectic audience, was the perfect testing ground. That's insane. Is it? Amy asked. You found military-grade encryption in a phone call from 2000. You got a message telling you to stop digging from someone using a military installations network. You're telling me that's normal. I couldn't argue with that. I'm sending you something, Amy said. A file Art gave me before he died. He made me promise to only share it. If someone actually got close to figuring this out, check your email in 5 minutes. Wait! But she'd already hung up. Acket 4. The Conspiracy Twist, Chapter 8. The Fort Meade File. The email arrived exactly 5 minutes later. No message, just an attachment. A scanned PDF labelled Fort Meade Analysis, Titor Case, Classified. My hands were shaking as I opened it. The document was a DARPA memo dated March 2003. Most of it was redacted, black bars covering entire paragraphs. But enough remained to be absolutely terrifying. The header read, Subject, Temporal Communication Leakage, Case Study, Titor Broadcast. The visible portion stated, Signals analysed from Coast to Coast AM, broadcast dated January 2001, show anomalous patterns consistent with temporal offset interference. Frequency analysis reveals quantum acoustic signatures that match predicted outputs from Project Looking Glass prototype systems tested between 1997 and 2000. Conclusion: the subject known as John Titor was either in possession of or in proximity to a temporal displacement device during broadcast transmissions. The signals are consistent with quantum entanglement communication across temporal barriers. Calls correlated with anomalies monitored by NSA's Project Looking Glass observation posts during the same time period, showing temporal probability fluctuations that suggest active manipulation of timeline causality. Recommendation: reclassify case under SAP protocols. Monitor all further Titor-related communications. Suppress public investigation through disinformation and discrediting campaigns. Transfer file oversight to redacted under satellite research contract cover designation. The document was stamped classified and bore the seal of DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. I read it 5 times. Then I researched Project Looking Glass. The classified project was partially revealed through leaked documents in the mid-2000s. It allegedly involved using experimental technology to view probable future timelines, based on something called the Burish Papers, and connected to research at S4, a rumoured underground facility near Area 51. Most researchers dismissed it as disinformation or fantasy, but here was an official document, or what appeared to be one, connecting it directly to the John Titor case. Chapter 9. Ethan's Realization. I spent 3 days cross-referencing everything I'd found. The audio anomalies, the DARPA memo, Amy's testimony about Art Bell's investigation, the message from White Sands routed through CERN, the Haber connection in Florida. And I realised something that made every conspiracy theory I'd ever read seem tame by comparison. What if John Titor's entire appearance wasn't about convincing anyone of anything? What if it was never meant to be believed? Think about it from the perspective of someone running a temporal communication experiment. You can't just broadcast a message to the past openly. That would cause panic, investigation, immediate government response. You'd never get clean data. You'd corrupt the entire experiment. But what if you wrapped your message in absurdity? What if you made it part of internet culture, conspiracy theory, entertainment? What if you made it just plausible enough to attract attention, but just outlandish enough that anyone who believed it would be dismissed? You could send signals, test equipment, calibrate temporal communication systems, measure causality effects, all while hiding in the noise of the late-night radio and internet forums. Coast to Coast AM was perfect for this. A show dedicated to fringe topics, with a global audience of people predisposed to believe in the strange and unexplained. Broadcast late at night when critical thinking is lower and imagination runs higher. Archived for future reference, but dismissed by mainstream culture. John Titor wasn't trying to warn us of the future. John Titor was calibrating a device, testing whether messages could be sent backward through time and be received intact, ensuring that specific information reached specific points in the timeline, creating a documented test case that could be analysed later to refine the technology. And the predictions that didn't come true, those weren't failures, those were the point. By making predictions that could be explained away with different timelines, Titor ensured that the case would never be definitively solved. It would remain in a state of quantum uncertainty, both real and fake simultaneously, depending on who you asked. The perfect cover for experimental temporal communication technology. I sat in my dark apartment and realised I'd stumbled onto something that was never meant to be understood, until whoever sent the messages wanted it understood. Act 5. The Final Contact. Chapter 10. Ethan receives coordinates. The message appeared on my computer screen at 3:47 a.m. on December 10th, 2023. My computer was off, fully shut down. I'd turned it off hours earlier and unplugged it from the internet, paranoid after everything I'd discovered. But when I woke up to use the bathroom, I saw light coming from my office. My monitor was on, displaying a message in plain text on a black background. You have seen too much. If you want the truth, come to these coordinates. Below the message, latitude and longitude coordinates. My skin went cold. I hadn't imagined the impossible. My computer had turned itself on somehow, despite being physically disconnected from power and network. I grabbed my phone and entered the coordinates into a map application. Gainesville, Florida. A residential address in a suburban neighbourhood. I pulled up the street view. A modest house with a small yard. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that screamed temporal research facility or government conspiracy. But I recognised the area. I'd seen it before in my research. It was near where Larry Haber lived, the lawyer connected to the Titer Foundation, and according to the original Titer posts, it was near the coordinates where John Titer claimed he would return home before leaving our timeline in March 2001. The message on my computer screen flickered, then new text appeared. You have 48 hours, come alone, bring the tape, this is not a request. The screen went black. My computer wouldn't turn back on. Chapter 11. The Empty House. I should have called the police. I should have called Amy. I should have done anything except what I actually did. But I've never been good at making smart decisions when curiosity is involved. I booked a flight to Florida that morning. Red-eye departure, arriving in Gainesville just after dawn. I brought the cassette tape in my carry-on, wrapped in bubble wrap and tucked into a padded case. The house matched the street view images perfectly. Small, single-storey, beige siding, brown roof. A for sale sign in the front yard, faded and crooked like it had been there for months. No cars in the driveway. No signs of occupancy. I sat in my rental car across the street for 20 minutes watching. No movement, no lights, nothing. Finally, I walked up to the front door. It was unlocked. The interior was empty. Completely empty. No furniture, no decorations, no indication anyone had lived there recently. Just bare walls and carpet that still showed vacuum marks from a cleaning service. But in the centre of the living room floor, there was something. A metal cylinder, about 3 feet tall, 2 feet in diameter, covered in what looked like precision-machined components. Coils, sensors, small crystalline structures embedded in the casing. It was sitting on a circular base covered in symbols that might have been mathematical equations or might have been something else entirely. Next to it, a piece of paper taped to the floor. I walked over slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The note read, in printed text, "This isn't for your world." I stared at the cylinder. It matched the diagrams John Titer had posted back in 2001. The C204 temporal displacement unit. Or at least something that looked exactly like those schematics. I reached out to touch it, and the room vibrated, not shaking, not movement. The air itself seemed to vibrate, like reality was suddenly running at the wrong frequency. The hum I'd heard in the audio files filled the space so loud it hurt my teeth. The walls flickered. For just a moment I saw through them, or saw them in a different configuration, different paint colour, different carpet. Furniture present where there was none, and then I saw him, standing in the corner of the room wearing what looked like a military-style coat. Dark fabric, heavy-duty with patches on the shoulders. One patch was clearly visible. It read, Temporal Recon Division 2036. The figure was shadow-like, not quite solid, like looking at someone through frosted glass. But I could see enough to know it was a person. Male, probably, tall, standing completely still, watching me. We made eye contact, or at least I think we did. It's hard to explain. Looking at him was like looking at someone through water that was flowing in the wrong direction. He raised one hand, not waving, more like a gesture of acknowledgement or warning. Then the vibration stopped. The hum cut off instantly. The room snapped back to normal, empty, quiet, ordinary. The cylinder was gone. The note was gone. I was standing alone in an empty house in Florida, having just experienced something I would never be able to adequately explain. I walked out, got in my rental car, and drove back to the airport. I didn't look back. Epilogue. The case closes itself. I got home to find my computer reformatted. Not wiped, reformatted. Clean operating system installation, all my files gone, including everything related to John Titor. The cassette tape Bill Anders had sold me was blank. I played it front to back, nothing but magnetic hiss. I tried to contact Amy Jacobs. Every phone number I had for her was disconnected. Every email bounced back. I searched for her online and found nothing. No social media, no professional profiles, no obituary, nothing. It was like she'd never existed. I went back to the forum where the message about me had appeared. The post was gone. Not just deleted, gone from the archive, gone from cached versions, gone from the Wayback Machine. Like it had never been posted. I checked the Coast to Coast AM archives for the John Titor episodes. Every single one showed as currently unavailable due to rights issues. Art Bell's entire Titor discussion catalogue was inaccessible. I tried to contact Larry Haber again. His law office website was down. His phone number led to a disconnected message. I pulled out the DARPA document Amy had sent me. I opened the file. Blank PDF. 0 pages. Every single piece of evidence I'd collected over 2 months of investigation was gone. Erased. Disappeared like it had never existed. The only thing I had left was my memory. And even that felt uncertain now. Like maybe I'd dreamed the whole thing. Maybe I'd had some kind of breakdown. Maybe the insomnia and the obsession had finally caught up with me, and I'd hallucinated an entire conspiracy. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I know what I experienced. And I think I finally understand what John Titor really was. Time travel might not be about visiting the past. It might be about editing it, adjusting the timeline in subtle ways, ensuring certain events occur or don't occur, sending information backward to specific points to calibrate and refine the ability to manipulate causality. And if you can edit the past, you can also edit the present. You can remove evidence, erase records, make sure investigations never happened. I think John Titor, or whoever was behind that name, returned to make sure my investigation disappeared. Not by threatening me, not by silencing me, but by retroactively ensuring I never had anything to investigate in the first place. Which means either I'm crazy, or I'm one of the few people who remembers a version of events that no longer exists in our timeline. I still listen to Coast, still stay up late, unable to sleep, chasing mysteries and conspiracies. But I don't research time travel anymore. I don't dig into classified projects or unexplained phenomena. Because now I know that some cases aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be buried. And sometimes, if you dig too deep, the case buries you instead. If you found yourself listening to this entire story and wanting to know more, I hope you'll use your hype points on the video if you enjoyed it. It genuinely helps the channel in ways you might not realise, and we're grateful for every single one of you who takes the time to support what we do here. Drop a comment if you feel like it. Tell us what time it is where you are, where you're listening from in the world. We love seeing where all of you are tuning in from, across time zones and continents. But more importantly, if you've ever experienced something you can't explain, something that doesn't quite fit with the reality you think you know, maybe keep it to yourself. Some truths aren't meant to be shared. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Because in the end, the John Titor case taught me one thing above all else. Reality is more fragile than we think. And sometimes the people who try to understand how fragile it is are the ones who find out just how easily it can be edited, adjusted, and rewritten. I'm Ethan Ward, and this is the case I shouldn't have reopened. Sleep well, everyone, and remember, some timelines are better left unexplored. Before we begin tonight's story, if you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes an enormous difference for us as well. And if you want, drop a comment telling us what time it is, where you are, and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening. And if you enjoy these deep dives into history's mysteries, please subscribe. Tonight's story comes from a suggestion by Dogface680, and we cannot thank you enough for this idea. This is one of the most compelling conspiracy theories rooted in actual Cold War history. And what makes it so haunting is how much of it is documented fact. What you're about to hear sounds impossible. A 4-star general, a war hero, the man who helped liberate Europe from Nazi tyranny, dead in a hospital bed just months after victory, following a minor car accident that shouldn't have killed anyone. No autopsy, no investigation. Medical records vanished, witnesses disappeared, and decades later, a former intelligence operative steps forward with a confession that changes everything. This is the story of General George Smith Patton Jr., the man who won the war but lost the peace, the general who believed he had fought in past lives alongside Alexander the Great and Napoleon Bonaparte, who believed in destiny and glory and refused to be silent when silence was demanded. This is the story of his mysterious death, and the conspiracy theory that suggests the greatest threat to George Patton wasn't the Nazi Wehrmacht, it was his own government. December 9th, 1945. Near Mannheim, Germany. The war is over. Europe lies in ruins. Cities reduced to rubble. Railways destroyed. Bridges collapsed. Millions dead, millions more displaced. The Third Reich, which promised to last 1,000 years, lasted 12 and ended in a Berlin bunker with a gunshot. Victory belongs to the Allies, and General George Smith Patton Jr., the most aggressive, most decorated, most controversial American commander of World War II, sits in occupied Germany with nothing left to conquer. He is 60 years old. His hair is silver. His face is weathered from years of command in the Mediterranean sun, the French countryside, the German winter. He wears his pearl-handled revolvers on his hips, relics of an earlier era when generals still led cavalry charges. He looks like something from another century, and in many ways he is. Patton believes he fought at the walls of Troy. He believes he rode with the Romans into Carthage. He believes he charged with Napoleon at Austerlitz. Past life memories, he calls them. Visions of ancient battles that feel more real than dreams. His officers think he's eccentric. His soldiers think he's touched by God. His enemies learned not to think about him at all until it was too late. But now, in December 1945, Patton is no longer commanding armies. He is no longer shaping strategy. He is no longer needed. The Third Army, which he led across France and into the heart of Germany, has been reassigned. His new command is a paper organisation with no soldiers, no tanks, no mission beyond compiling reports that no one will read. He is waiting to go home, and he is angry. That morning, December 9th, Patton wakes before dawn in his quarters at Bad Nauheim, a spa town north of Frankfurt that serves as headquarters for what remains of his command. He eats breakfast alone, as is his custom. Eggs, toast, coffee. He reviews intelligence reports from the Soviet occupation zone. He reads dispatches from Washington. He writes in his diary, the leather-bound journal he has kept since West Point, filling page after page with his cramped handwriting. Today's entry is bitter. They have sidelined me. Eisenhower fears what I might say. The politicians fear what I might do. The Soviets fear I might be right. So here I sit, a relic, while Europe burns. He signs his name with a flourish, as always. George Smith Patton Jr., 4 stars, Third Army. At 9:30 in the morning, he receives word that a pheasant hunting expedition has been arranged for that afternoon. It's one of his few remaining pleasures, a brief escape from the tedium of meaningless command. His Chief of Staff, Major General Hobart Gay, will accompany him. They'll take one of the staff cars, drive south toward Mannheim, spend a few hours in the countryside. It should be routine. At 11 o'clock, Patton descends the stairs of his headquarters building. His boots echo on the marble floors. Officers snap to attention as he passes. He returns their salutes mechanically, his mind already elsewhere, already planning the afternoon hunt, already thinking about the estate where the pheasants run wild. Outside, a Cadillac Model 75 sedan waits. Black paint, chrome trim, the kind of vehicle befitting a general officer. The driver stands beside it, a young private first class who has been assigned to Patton's detail for less than 2 weeks. This is the first irregularity. Patton's regular driver, a sergeant named John Mims, who had driven him for 3 years through combat and occupation, was transferred on December 1st. No explanation was given. Mims, interviewed decades later by researchers, said the transfer was sudden and unusual. He was given orders to report to another unit immediately. He never drove for Patton again. The replacement driver's name is in the accident report, but researchers have never been able to locate his service records. The man seems to have vanished from military documentation after December 9th. Patton climbs into the back seat. General Gay joins him. The driver starts the engine. They pull out of the headquarters compound and onto the road leading south. It's a cold morning. Frost covers the fields. The sky is grey, low clouds threatening snow. The roads are in poor condition, still cratered from the fighting, still littered with debris from the bombardment that reduced Mannheim to ruins earlier in the war. Traffic is light, a few military trucks, some civilian vehicles, German citizens walking along the roadside, bundled against the cold, their faces hollow with hunger and defeat. Patton watches the landscape pass. He has driven these roads dozens of times. He knows every turn, every checkpoint, every landmark. At approximately 11:45, near a railroad crossing on the outskirts of Mannheim, the car approaches an intersection. A United States Army truck, a 2.5-ton vehicle painted olive drab, approaches from a side road. What happens next takes 3 seconds. The truck makes a sudden left turn, cutting directly across the path of Patton's Cadillac. The driver of the Cadillac swerves right, tyres skidding on the frost-slicked pavement. The vehicles collide, the sound of metal against metal, the crunch of breaking glass, the hiss of steam from a ruptured radiator, and then silence. The driver of the Cadillac climbs out, shaken but uninjured. General Gay opens his door, checking himself for injuries. Nothing. A few bruises, perhaps. Nothing serious. He turns to check on Patton and sees him slumped in the back seat, conscious but unable to move. "My neck," Patton says quietly. "I think my neck is broken." Within minutes, military police arrive. Within an hour, Patton is on his way to Heidelberg. Within days, the official story begins to fracture under the weight of its own inconsistencies. And within 12 days, George Smith Patton Jr. is dead. Chapter 1. The General Who Became a Problem. To understand why conspiracy theories surround Patton's death, you have to understand who Patton was in the final months of his life, and more importantly, what he represented to the emerging Cold War order. George Smith Patton Jr. was never meant for peacetime. He was born into a military family in California in 1885. His grandfather fought for the Confederacy. His father was a politician. Young George grew up hearing stories of cavalry charges and desperate last stands, of honour and glory and the warrior's code. He attended the Virginia Military Institute, then West Point. He competed in the Stockholm Olympics in 1912, finishing 5th in the modern pentathlon. He served under General John Pershing in Mexico, chasing Pancho Villa through the desert. He commanded tanks in World War I, was wounded in combat, came home with a chest full of medals and a reputation as a fighter. Between the wars, he studied. He read military history obsessively. Caesar, Alexander, Hannibal, Frederick the Great, Napoleon. He believed war was an art form, that great commanders were born, not made, that destiny selected certain men for greatness. He believed he was one of those men. When World War II came, Patton was ready. He commanded American forces in North Africa, in Sicily, in France. His Third Army swept across Europe faster than anyone thought possible. His tactics were aggressive, sometimes reckless. He believed in speed and shock and overwhelming force. He believed hesitation killed more soldiers than enemy fire. His methods worked. The Germans feared him more than any other Allied commander. They repositioned entire divisions based on intelligence about Patton's location. They assumed wherever Patton was, the main attack would follow. Often, they were right. But Patton was more than just a brilliant tactician. He was also politically tone-deaf, personally abrasive, and constitutionally incapable of diplomacy. He slapped shell-shocked soldiers in field hospitals, calling them cowards. He gave speeches praising the fighting spirit of the German army. He made jokes about the Holocaust that appalled other officers. He criticised Allied strategy in press conferences. He feuded with British commanders. He defied orders when he thought they were stupid. Eisenhower protected him during the war because Patton won battles. But when the war ended, Patton became expendable. More than that, he became dangerous. Because Patton refused to accept the post-war order. May 8th, 1945. Germany surrenders unconditionally. The war in Europe is over. Allied leaders meet in Potsdam to negotiate the peace. Europe is divided. The Soviet Union takes the east, America and Britain take the west. Borders are redrawn, governments are installed, millions of people are displaced, moved, relocated to fit the new map. Patton watches this happen and sees betrayal. The Allies, he argues, fought to liberate Europe from tyranny. Now they're handing half of Europe to Stalin, a dictator as brutal as Hitler, a regime as totalitarian as the Nazis. He makes this argument publicly. In June 1945, Patton gives a speech in Los Angeles comparing the Soviet Communist Party to the Nazi Party. He calls both totalitarian threats to freedom. He suggests the Allies defeated the wrong enemy, that Germany should have been turned against the Soviet Union instead of being destroyed. The backlash is immediate. Politicians demand his resignation. Newspapers condemn him. The War Department issues official reprimands. President Truman, already dealing with the complexities of Soviet relations, is furious. Eisenhower summons Patton to his headquarters. The meeting does not go well. Eisenhower and Patton were friends once. They rose through the ranks together, served together between the wars, understood each other. But the war changed them both. Eisenhower became a political general, a coalition builder, a man who understood that winning the peace required compromise and patience. Patton remained a warrior who believed wars should be fought without hesitation and won without apology. In Eisenhower's office, Patton is told his public statements are unacceptable. He is ordered to stop criticising Soviet policy. He is warned that further incidents will result in his removal from command. Patton argues back. He presents intelligence reports about Soviet violations of ceasefire agreements. He describes forced population transfers, summary executions, political purges. He insists someone needs to tell the American people what's happening in occupied Europe. Eisenhower tells him that someone is not going to be Patton. The conversation ends badly. Within weeks, Patton is relieved of command of the Third Army and reassigned to the 15th Army, a paper organisation with no operational role. His job now is to compile lessons learned from the European campaign, to write reports analysing tactics and strategy for future military planners. It's a desk job. To a man like Patton, it's worse than death. Internal War Department memos from this period reveal the thinking behind the reassignment. One memo describes Patton as politically dangerous and increasingly uncontrollable. Another warns that Patton's celebrity status among soldiers and veterans makes him a potential political threat to current foreign policy initiatives. A third memo, written by a senior intelligence officer, suggests that Patton's return to the United States should be delayed indefinitely to prevent him from influencing public opinion regarding Soviet intentions. These memos were classified for decades. When they were finally released under Freedom of Information Act requests in the 1980s, they revealed something important. By October 1945, senior American officials viewed Patton not as an asset but as a liability, and they were actively working to neutralise him. Chapter 2. The Diaries and the Warnings. General Patton kept meticulous diaries throughout his military career. These weren't casual journals. They were detailed historical records, written in his own hand, documenting everything from tactical decisions to personal reflections. He wrote almost every day, sometimes for hours, filling leather-bound volumes with his cramped, precise handwriting. He believed history would vindicate him. He wanted his perspective preserved for future generations. After his death, the diaries were collected by his family. Some entries were published in biographies, others remained private for decades. Some have never been fully released, held back by the Patten family estate for reasons never publicly explained. But the entries that have been made public from October and November 1945 paint a disturbing picture of a man who believed he was being watched, controlled, and silenced. October 2nd, 1945. Patten attends a meeting with Soviet officers to coordinate occupation zones. The meeting is tense. The Soviets refuse to cooperate on prisoner exchanges. They deny Allied access to certain territories. They claim violations of ceasefire agreements that Patten knows are fabricated. He writes, "The Russians are impossible. They lie about everything. They're worse than the Nazis and no one wants to admit it. Eisenhower orders me to maintain diplomatic relations. I'd rather maintain my rifle aimed at their headquarters." October 15th, 1945. Patten inspects Soviet troop positions along the occupation zone boundary. He notes their equipment, their readiness, their disposition. What he sees alarms him. He writes, "Soviet forces are not demobilizing. They're repositioning. They have combat units forward deployed, supply lines established, logistics prepared for offensive operations. If we have to fight them, and I believe we will, we should do it now while our armies are still here, still equipped, still ready. In 2 years, we'll have nothing in Europe, and they'll have everything." October 23rd, 1945. Patten meets with German civilians, former Wehrmacht officers, refugees fleeing Soviet occupation. They tell him stories of mass arrests, forced labour, summary executions, entire villages emptied. He writes, "We promised these people freedom. We told them we were liberating them from tyranny. Now we're handing them to Stalin, who is every bit as brutal as Hitler. The only difference is Stalin is our ally, so we pretend not to see what he's doing. History will judge us harshly for this betrayal." October 31st, 1945. Patten submits a request for extended leave to return to the United States. He wants to visit family, rest, recover from years of combat command. He also wants to speak freely, away from military censorship about what he's witnessed in Europe. The request is denied by the War Department. No explanation is provided. He writes, "They want me here where they can watch me, where they can control what I say, where I can't reach the American people. I understand their game now." November 7th, 1945. Patten has lunch with a journalist from the New York Herald Tribune. The interview is supposed to be off the record, a background briefing about post-war Europe. Patten speaks candidly about Soviet intentions, about Allied failures, about the need for American military readiness. 2 days later, the journalist contacts Patten. The interview has been killed by editors. Someone from the War Department called the newspaper and asked that the story not run. The journalist is apologetic but clear. The article will not be published. Patten writes, "Even the press is controlled now. The truth is too dangerous for the American people to hear. They want everyone to believe we won the war, and everything is fine now. But nothing is fine. Everything we fought for is being given away, and anyone who points this out is silenced." November the 19th, 1945. Patten receives notice that his security detail is being changed. His regular driver, his aides, his bodyguards, men who have served with him for years are being reassigned. New personnel are being assigned to replace them. The official reason is routine rotation of personnel. Patten doesn't believe it. He writes, "They're putting watchers around me, new people who report to someone else. I recognise the pattern. I've used it myself in our intelligence operations. When you want to monitor someone, you put your own people next to them. I'm being treated like a security threat in my own command." November 25th, 1945. Patten's wife, Beatrice, writes him from the United States. She's worried about him. His letters have become dark, paranoid. He writes about being watched, about feeling trapped. She asks if he's well. He writes back, but his response never makes it into his diary. Later, Beatrice told biographers that Patton's letter frightened her. He wrote that he was planning to return home soon, and caused them a lot of trouble. He wrote that he intended to speak publicly about Soviet aggression and Allied failures. He wrote that he knew this would end his military career, but he didn't care anymore. He wrote, "Some fights are worth the cost." December 1st, 1945. Patton's regular driver, Sergeant John Mims, is abruptly transferred to another unit. Mims has driven Patton for 3 years through North Africa, Sicily, France, Germany. He knows Patton's habits, his routes, his preferences. He's loyal, competent, trusted. The transfer happens overnight. Mims is given orders to report immediately to a quartermaster unit in Belgium. He's not allowed to say goodbye to Patton. A new driver is assigned, a young private first class who's been in the European theatre for less than 3 months. Patton writes, "Even my driver is replaced now. They're not even being subtle about it anymore." This is Patton's last diary entry. 8 days later, he's in the car accident. Chapter 3. The collision that changed everything. December the 9th, 1945. Late morning. General Patton's Cadillac sedan leaves his headquarters in Bad Nauheim at approximately 1100 hours. The sky is overcast, threatening snow. Temperature is just above freezing. The roads are slick with frost but passable. Patton sits in the back seat. He's dressed in his uniform, wearing his leather jacket against the cold. His pearl-handled revolvers are on his hips. He carries a walking stick, an affectation from his days of cavalry service. Major General Hobart Gay sits beside him. Gay has served as Patton's chief of staff throughout the war. He's one of Patton's few remaining friends in the High Command, one of the few officers who still speaks to him regularly after his controversial statements. The new driver, whose name appears in the accident report as Private First Class Horace Woodring, sits behind the wheel. He's nervous. He's only driven for Patton a handful of times. He's not familiar with the General's preferences, his habits, his routes. The drive should take less than an hour. They follow the main road south from Bad Nauheim, through small German towns still recovering from the war. Mannheim was one of the most heavily bombed cities in Germany. The RAF and American 8th Air Force dropped thousands of tons of explosives on its industrial districts. Much of the city centre was destroyed. Rebuilding has barely begun. The roads through Mannheim are in poor condition. Craters from bombs, debris from collapsed buildings. Some streets are still blocked entirely, forcing detours through unfamiliar routes. At 11:43, according to the accident report, Patton's Cadillac approaches a railroad crossing on the outskirts of Mannheim. The area is semi-rural, factories mixed with farmland. Traffic is light. A United States Army truck, identified in the report as a GMC 2.5-ton cargo vehicle, approaches from a side road on the left. According to the truck driver's statement, taken by military police at the scene, he did not see the Cadillac approaching. He claimed the sun was in his eyes, though the day was overcast. He claimed he was unfamiliar with the intersection, though the road was clearly marked. He claimed he made the turn at normal speed, though witnesses said the truck accelerated suddenly. The Cadillac's driver swerves right to avoid impact. Too late. The vehicles collide at the intersection. Now here's where the official story begins to fall apart. The collision is low speed. The Cadillac is travelling approximately 35 miles per hour. The truck is travelling approximately 15 miles per hour. The impact is glancing, not head-on. The Cadillac's front passenger side strikes the truck's rear cargo area. The damage is minor. The Cadillac's front bumper is bent. The headlight is broken. The hood is dented. The truck's rear panel is scraped but intact. Both vehicles remain operational. The Cadillac's driver, Private First Class Woodring, is uninjured. He has a small bruise on his hand from the steering wheel. Nothing else. Major General Gay is uninjured. He experiences momentary shock from the impact, but suffers no physical trauma. The truck driver is uninjured. He climbs out of his cab without assistance. General Patton, sitting in the back seat of the Cadillac, suffers catastrophic injuries. According to the initial medical assessment, Patton was thrown forward in the collision. His head struck a metal partition or support structure in the car's interior. The impact caused acute cervical spine trauma, specifically a comminuted fracture of the third cervical vertebra and a vertical fracture of the fourth cervical vertebra. The injury results in immediate complete paralysis from the neck down. Multiple forensic analysts who examined the case decades later noted severe inconsistencies with this explanation. First, the injury pattern. A forward impact of the type described should cause predictable trauma. Facial injuries, chest contusions, possibly head trauma. The passenger would hit the seat in front of them, the back of the driver's seat, which is padded. Instead, Patton sustained a precise cervical fracture with no facial injuries, no chest trauma, no head contusions. Second, the biomechanics. For Patton to strike the partition with enough force to fracture his cervical spine, he would need to be travelling at significant speed relative to the car's interior. But the collision was low speed, and Patton was seated wearing his heavy leather jacket, which would have provided some padding. Third, the other passengers, both the driver and General Gay, sitting in front of Patton, experienced minimal impact forces. Gay later described the collision as a solid bump, nothing more. Yet Patton, behind them, experienced forces sufficient to break his neck. One forensic pathologist who reviewed the case in the 1990s suggested the injury pattern was more consistent with a direct blow to the back or side of the neck, the kind of trauma that might result from being struck by a hard object, rather than from impact with a car's interior. Another analyst noted that the specific fracture pattern, comminuted fracture of cervical 3, vertical fracture of cervical 4, is relatively rare in motor vehicle accidents, but more common in cases of direct trauma to the posterior neck. Without an autopsy, without X-rays beyond the initial hospital films, without detailed forensic analysis, these observations remain speculative. But they raise questions. Then there's the matter of the truck driver. According to the accident report, the driver was interviewed by military police at the scene. He provided a statement describing the collision. He was cited for failure to yield. He was released. His name appears in the report as Private Robert Thompson. No unit is listed. No serial number is recorded. No permanent address is given. Researchers have spent decades trying to locate Private Robert Thompson. Military personnel databases have no record of anyone by that name serving in the European theatre in December 1945. The truck's serial number, listed in the accident report, corresponds to a vehicle assigned to the Quartermaster Corps. But when historians tried to trace the vehicle's movement logs, maintenance records, and assignment history, they found nothing. The truck existed on paper, but vanished from all documentation after December 9th. The military police who responded to the scene should have filed detailed reports, taken photographs, secured evidence. Standard accident investigation procedure, especially for a collision involving a 4-star general. No photographs were ever released. The military police reports were classified, then reported lost. No physical evidence from the scene was preserved. Within hours, the Cadillac was repaired and returned to the motor pool. The truck disappeared entirely. And Private Robert Thompson was never seen again. Chapter 4. 12 days in Heidelberg. The Heidelberg Army Hospital in December 1945 was one of the finest medical facilities in Europe. It had treated thousands of wounded soldiers during the war. It had experienced trauma surgeons, skilled nurses, modern equipment for 1940s medicine. The hospital specialised in combat injuries, including complex trauma cases that required intensive care. Spinal injuries like Patton's were rare but not unprecedented. The medical staff understood the protocols: immobilisation, prevention of secondary injury, monitoring for complications, physical therapy when possible. Patton arrived at the hospital at approximately 1300 hours on December 9th, less than 90 minutes after the accident. He was conscious, alert, able to speak. He described the accident to doctors. He reported complete loss of sensation and movement below his neck. He remained calm, even joking with the medical staff. "I've been closer to death than this before," he told one nurse. "I'll be fine." Initial X-rays confirmed the cervical fractures. Neurological examination confirmed complete paralysis below the level of injury, but the attending physicians were cautiously optimistic. The fractures, while severe, showed no signs of spinal cord transection. There was hope that with proper immobilization and time, some nerve function might return. Complete recovery was unlikely, but partial recovery was possible. Patton was placed in skull traction, a device that immobilized his head and neck to prevent further injury. He was given oxygen support. His vital signs were monitored continuously. Nurses attended him around the clock. On December 10th, one day after the accident, Patton's condition appeared stable. His vital signs were strong. He was communicating with staff. He showed no signs of infection or complications. On December 11th, Patton's wife Beatrice arrived from the United States. The Army had arranged emergency transport, flying her across the Atlantic on a military aircraft. She was escorted by senior officers who had worked to expedite her travel. When she entered Patton's room, he smiled. "I'm in a hell of a fix this time," he told her. She sat beside his bed and held his hand. He couldn't feel it, but the gesture mattered. For the next few days, Patton's condition remained stable. Doctors noted slight improvement in some reflexes. There was cautious talk of eventual transfer to a specialized facility in the United States. Physical therapy was discussed. Patton himself remained optimistic. He made plans. He talked about recovery. He joked about getting back to work. On December 13th, 4 days after the accident, Patton's condition began to change. He developed a slight fever. His breathing became more laboured. Doctors suspected early pneumonia, a common complication in paralysed patients who cannot cough effectively to clear their lungs. Antibiotics were administered. Oxygen support was increased. On December 14th, the fever worsened. Patton's oxygen saturation dropped. His breathing became increasingly difficult. The medical staff worked to keep his airways clear, but the paralysis made it nearly impossible for him to assist in his own treatment. On December 15th, 6 days after the accident, Patton's condition took a dramatic turn for the worse. He developed severe pulmonary edema, fluid accumulation in the lungs. His heart rate became irregular. His blood pressure fluctuated wildly. The doctors diagnosed acute heart failure, possibly triggered by a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that had travelled from his immobilised legs to his lungs. Emergency treatment was initiated, but Patton's condition continued to deteriorate. Over the next 6 days, he slipped in and out of consciousness. The fever persisted. The pulmonary edema worsened. His heart struggled to maintain adequate circulation. On December the 21st, 12 days after the accident, at 1750 hours, General George Smith Patton Jr. died. The official cause of death, pulmonary embolism and congestive heart failure secondary to his injuries. The death certificate was signed by the attending physicians. The hospital issued a statement expressing condolences. The Army notified next of kin. Flags were lowered to half-staff, and then the irregularities began. First, no autopsy was performed. This is unusual for several reasons. Patton was a 4-star general, one of the most prominent military figures in American history. His death under medical care, with unexpected complications arising rapidly, would normally warrant a thorough post-mortem examination. The official explanation was that the family declined an autopsy. But Beatrice Patton later disputed this claim. In interviews with biographers, she stated she was never asked about an autopsy. She said the Army simply informed her that her husband's body would be prepared for burial and that no autopsy was necessary or planned. She said she didn't question the decision at the time. She was grieving, exhausted, overwhelmed. She trusted the military doctors who told her Patton died of natural complications from his injuries. Only later did she wonder why they were so insistent that no autopsy be performed. Second, Patton's complete medical records from Heidelberg Hospital were never released to the family. Beatrice requested the files multiple times over the following years. She wanted to understand what happened to her husband, why he declined so rapidly, whether everything possible had been done to save him. Her requests were denied. The Army told her the medical records were classified for reasons of operational security. She was told the files contained sensitive information about medical procedures and treatment protocols that could not be disclosed. She never received the records. When historians and researchers sought the files decades later under Freedom of Information Act requests, they were told the records were missing. Some reports claim the files were destroyed in the 1960s per routine document retention policies. Other reports claim the files were lost when Heidelberg Hospital closed. Still other reports claim the files are held in classified archives but remain restricted. No one has seen Patton's complete medical records since December 1945. Third, several members of the medical staff who treated Patton were transferred shortly after his death. One surgeon was reassigned to a hospital in Japan. A nurse was transferred to a facility in England. The hospital administrator retired from military service within weeks of Patton's death. When researchers tried to interview these individuals in later years, most declined to participate. Some claimed they couldn't remember details of Patton's case. Others said they were bound by military confidentiality, even decades later. One physician agreed to an interview but died before it could be conducted. One nurse who worked in Heidelberg Hospital during December 1945 gave a brief interview to a researcher in 1976. She described unusual activity in the days before Patton died. She mentioned restricted access to Patton's room. She said only certain staff members were allowed to enter. She described visitors who came late at night, men in military uniforms who weren't logged in the visitor registry. She mentioned medical procedures that weren't part of standard treatment protocols. She said Patton received injections she didn't recognise, medications that weren't listed on his chart. When the researcher pressed for details, the nurse became vague and uncomfortable. She ended the interview abruptly and refused further contact. She died 2 years later. No additional interviews were ever conducted. Fourth, the timeline of Patton's decline doesn't match typical post-injury progression. Spinal injury patients certainly face complications. Pneumonia is common because paralysed patients cannot clear their lungs effectively. Blood clots are common because immobilised patients cannot move their limbs. Heart failure can occur due to the stress of injury and prolonged bed rest. But the speed and severity of Patton's decline struck some medical experts as unusual. One pulmonologist who reviewed the case in the 1980s noted that Patton went from stable and communicative to critical and dying in less than a week. While complications can arise quickly, the progression described in the available documentation seemed unusually rapid for a patient receiving intensive care in a modern facility. Another physician, a toxicologist, reviewed the symptoms described in newspaper reports from December 1945. Sudden pulmonary edema, cardiac arrhythmia, rapid deterioration. He noted these symptoms could result from injury complications, but they could also result from certain poisonous substances. Specifically, he mentioned digitalis toxicity, which causes cardiac complications and pulmonary edema and would be difficult to detect without specific toxicology screening. Without an autopsy, without tissue samples, without toxicology analysis, there's no way to confirm or deny such theories. But the possibility exists, and that possibility, combined with all the other irregularities, fuels the conspiracy theory that Patton didn't die from his injuries. He was killed. Chapter 5. The OSS operative's confession. For more than 30 years, the official narrative of Patton's death remained unchallenged. Tragic accident, medical complications, natural death given his injuries. Historians wrote biographies portraying Patton as a brilliant but troubled commander whose life ended in unfortunate circumstances. Filmmakers made movies celebrating his military genius while depicting his death as a sad footnote to a legendary career. His death was accepted as tragic but unremarkable. And then, in 1979, everything changed. An 84-year-old man named Douglas DeWitt Bazata walked into the office of a military historian working on a book about the Office of Strategic Services. Bazata said he had information about General Patton's death, information that had been classified for more than 3 decades, information that, if true, would rewrite history. Douglas Bazata was not a conspiracy theorist. He was not a fringe figure seeking attention. He was a legitimate war hero with verifiable credentials and a documented history of service in America's wartime intelligence apparatus. Born in 1911, Bazata grew up in Pennsylvania and joined the Marine Corps in the early 1930s. He served in various capacities until the outbreak of World War II, when he was recruited by the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, America's wartime intelligence agency. The OSS conducted some of the most sensitive operations of the war: espionage, sabotage, assassination, support for resistance movements, operations that couldn't be acknowledged publicly and whose details remain classified even today. Bazata operated behind enemy lines in occupied Europe. He conducted sabotage operations against Nazi infrastructure. He organised partisan resistance networks. He gathered intelligence that helped Allied forces plan operations. His service record is documented in declassified OSS files. His decorations include the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, and various foreign awards from governments he aided during the war. He was not a man prone to fantasy or fabrication, and he said he had killed George Patton, not personally, not directly, but as part of an operation ordered by senior American intelligence officials. According to Bazata, in late November 1945, he was approached by a high-ranking OSS officer. Bazata declined to name this officer publicly, saying only that he held a senior position in intelligence operations and had authority to order field operations without political oversight. The officer told Bazata that General Patton had become a problem. Patton's public criticisms of Soviet policy were undermining Allied unity at a crucial moment. The Cold War was beginning. The Yalta Conference had established a delicate balance between the United States and Soviet Union. American intelligence agencies were working to establish networks in Eastern Europe, networks that required Soviet cooperation, or at least Soviet tolerance. Patton's rhetoric threatened all of it. His threats to return to the United States and speak publicly about Soviet aggression could turn American public opinion against cooperation with Stalin. His celebrity status among soldiers and veterans gave him a platform that could shape national policy. The officer told Bazata that political leadership had decided Patton needed to be silenced, permanently. Bazata claimed he refused at first. He argued that Patton was right about the Soviets, that someone needed to speak the truth about Soviet intentions. The officer told him this wasn't about truth. It was about stability. It was about maintaining diplomatic relationships long enough to establish American interests in post-war Europe. It was about preventing a premature confrontation with the Soviet Union that America wasn't ready to fight. The officer told him it was a matter of national security, and national security justified any action. Bazata claimed he was not directly involved in arranging the car accident. He said that aspect of the operation was handled by others, specialists in staged accidents and traffic collisions, but he confirmed the accident was not accidental. The truck driver, he said, was an operative, possibly OSS, possibly another agency. The collision was planned and executed as a way to remove Patton without raising suspicions of foul play. But the accident wasn't supposed to kill Patton. It was supposed to injure him seriously enough to prevent him from returning to the United States and speaking publicly. A career-ending injury that would sideline him while appearing accidental. The neck fracture was a bonus, ensuring Patton would never command again. But then Patton started to recover. Within days of the accident, doctors were talking about possible rehabilitation, about eventual transfer to the United States, about Patton potentially regaining some function. That wasn't acceptable. According to Bazata, the decision was made to finish the operation in the hospital. He claimed he was part of a team that had access to Heidelberg Hospital. They posed as medical staff or military visitors. They gained access to Patton's room, and they administered a substance that would trigger the complications that killed him. Bazata wouldn't specify what substance was used. He suggested something that would cause cardiac and pulmonary complications consistent with his injuries, something that would be difficult to detect without specific toxicology screening, something that would appear as natural progression of his condition. He said Patton died believing he was succumbing to his injuries, never knowing he was being murdered. Bazata claimed the operation was compartmentalized. Only a handful of people knew the full scope. The operatives involved were told only what they needed to know. Records were destroyed or classified. Witnesses were silenced through transfers, retirement, or more permanent means. He said Soviet intelligence was aware of the operation. They tacitly approved because Patton's anti-Soviet rhetoric was creating problems for Stalin as well. But the Soviets were not directly involved. This was an American operation for American reasons. He said the decision came from senior levels of American intelligence, possibly with approval from political leadership, though he had no direct evidence of White House involvement. He said he had stayed silent for more than 30 years out of loyalty to his country and fear of retaliation against himself and his family. But now, in his 80s, with most of the principals dead, he wanted the truth known. He wanted history to record what actually happened. Bezaita's confession was explosive. The researcher who first interviewed him was sceptical, but as Bezaita provided details, as he named other operations he had participated in, as he described OSS procedures and protocols that matched declassified documents, the researcher began to believe Bezaita was telling the truth, at least telling what he believed to be the truth. The researcher published a book in 1981 that included Bezaita's claims. The book created immediate controversy. Historians dismissed Bezaita as a fabricator. The CIA, successor to the OSS, denied any knowledge of operations targeting Patton. The army reaffirmed that Patton died of natural complications from his accident. But Bezaita didn't recant. In 1984, he attended an OSS Veterans Reunion dinner in Washington, D.C. During the event, he stood and publicly repeated his claims about Patton's death. He told a room full of former intelligence operatives that he had been part of the operation. The room fell silent. No one challenged him. No one confirmed him. But no one laughed either. The silence was telling. Several attendees later told journalists they believed Bezaita might be telling the truth. Others said the story was plausible, given what they knew about OSS operations during the period. Still others said Bezaita was either lying or confused, mixing real operations with imagined ones. Douglas Bezaita died in 1999 at age 88, maintaining his story until the end. To this day, no evidence has emerged to definitively prove or disprove his claims. But the fact that a legitimate OSS operative with a documented service record made such specific allegations has kept the conspiracy theory alive. Chapter 6. The Missing Evidence and the Cold War Context. If there was a conspiracy to assassinate General Patton, the evidence should exist somewhere. Intelligence agencies, even when conducting illegal operations, maintain records, operational plans, mission reports, personnel assignments, financial records, after-action reviews. These documents might be classified, compartmentalized, hidden in archives so secure that most government officials don't know they exist. But they exist. So researchers have been searching for decades. What they've found is a pattern of systematic absence. Every document that might confirm or disprove the assassination theory is either missing, destroyed, or classified beyond reach. Patton's medical records, missing. The accident investigation report, classified, then lost. OSS operational files from December 1945, heavily redacted. Personnel records for the truck driver, non-existent. Communications between the War Department and Patton's command, incomplete. Hospital visitor logs from Heidelberg, destroyed. Even routine documents that should exist, that have no national security implications, that would normally be preserved in military archives, are gone. This creates an evidentiary void. Conspiracy theorists point to the missing documents as proof of a cover-up. If there was nothing to hide, they argue, why are so many records missing? Skeptics argue that missing records prove nothing. Documents from 1945 are often incomplete. Archives have limited space. Files are destroyed per retention schedules. Sometimes things just get lost. Both arguments have merit, but the context matters. The Cold War was beginning in December 1945. The Office of Strategic Services was transitioning to the Central Intelligence Agency. American intelligence operations were becoming more sophisticated, more compartmentalized, more willing to conduct operations that violated both law and ethics in service of national security. We know this now because documents from that era have been declassified, slowly, over decades. We know about Operation Paperclip, which brought Nazi scientists to America despite their war crimes. We know about MK-Ultra, which conducted mind control experiments on unwitting American citizens. We know about COINTELPRO, which surveilled and disrupted domestic political groups. We know about assassination programs targeting foreign leaders like Fidel Castro and Patrice Lumumba. We know American intelligence agencies were capable of murder, deception, and massive cover-ups. So when someone suggests they might have killed an inconvenient general in 1945, it's not a crazy theory. It's consistent with what we know those agencies did. The question isn't whether American intelligence agencies were capable of such an operation. The question is whether they actually conducted one. And without the evidence, we cannot know for certain. Epilogue. What if Patton had lived? The final question haunts every discussion of Patton's death. What if he had survived? What if the accident had been less severe? What if he had recovered? What if he had returned to the United States? Would George Patton have become a political figure? Would he have run for office, bringing his celebrity status and military reputation into the political arena? Would he have testified before Congress about Soviet violations of the Yalta agreements, about forced population transfers, about political purges in Eastern Europe? Would he have written a book exposing what he viewed as Allied betrayals of the peoples we claim to liberate? Would he have shaped public opinion about the emerging Cold War? We'll never know. But the fact that we ask these questions reveals something important. Patton mattered. His voice mattered. His perspective, right or wrong, represented a viewpoint that vanished from American discourse after December 1945. Some historians argue that Patton's death was fortunate for America. His aggressive stance toward the Soviet Union could have triggered a premature confrontation that would have been catastrophic. The Cold War required careful management, patient containment, strategic diplomacy. Patton would have undermined all of that. Other historians argue that Patton was right, that confronting Soviet expansion immediately, while American forces were still mobilized in Europe, would have prevented decades of Cold War conflict, that his warnings about Stalin were prescient and should have been heeded. Both arguments assume Patton would have had significant influence if he had lived, and maybe that's why he died. The last line Patton wrote in his diary, just days before the accident, reads, "History will prove me right. They just don't want to hear it yet." He never got the chance to make his case. 79 years later, the debate continues. Was his death a tragic accident? A politically convenient outcome that some officials were relieved to see? Or a calculated assassination ordered by intelligence agencies that viewed him as a threat to national security? The files remain classified. The witnesses remain silent. The medical records remain missing. And George Smith Patton Jr. remains buried in Luxembourg, alongside the soldiers he commanded, his warnings unheeded, his voice silenced, his truth lost to history. Unless Douglas Bazata was telling the truth, unless somewhere, in some classified archive, the evidence exists, unless someday someone finds the files that prove what really happened on that December morning in 1945. Until then, we're left with questions, and sometimes the questions we cannot answer reveal more than the questions we can.